Good afternoon. I'd like to call this meeting of the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board to order. My name is Bob Ballou. I have the honor of serving as board chair. As originally scheduled, this meeting is slated to run until 5 p.m., but thanks to our 1.5 hour jump start, I think we stand an excellent chance of adjourning on time, if not early. Then again, this is the Fluke, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board, so let's see how we do. I'd like to begin by introducing the staff who are here at the end of the table with me. To my immediate right is Caitlin Sparks, the Commission's Black Sea Bass, Starks, of course I know it's Starks. That's close to Kathy Sparks, who's a colleague of mine in Rhode Island. So Caitlin Starks is to my immediate right, the Commission's Black Sea Bass FMP coordinator. And to Caitlin's right is, as you all know, Kirby Roots Murdy. He's continuing to serve as the FMP coordinator for Summer Flounder and Scup. Greg Wojcik, the board's technical committee chair, could not make it for this meeting. However, John Maniscalco, who is at the table serving as a board member with the New York delegation, also serves as a member of the TC. So if during the meeting the board has any questions for the TC, John has kindly agreed to make himself available for that purpose. Thanks, John. We appreciate your willingness to wear both hats on an as-needed basis. So with that, we will move right into the agenda for today. The first order of business is the approval of the agenda. Before I seek input from the board, I would just like to offer one suggested addition. Under other business, I would like to address the issue of whether there might be a path forward for generating updated information on stock status for Black Sea Bass this year and coordinating that with the Mid-Atlantic Council's SSC. That is the only suggested addition that I have. Does anyone on the board have any other recommended modifications to the agenda? Seeing none, is there any objection to approving the agenda as revised? Seeing none, the agenda as revised stands approved by consent, and we're on to item 2B, which is the approval of the proceedings from the board's October 18, 2017 meeting in Norfolk, Virginia. Are there any recommended changes to those minutes? Seeing none, is there any objection to approving those minutes as proposed? Seeing none, those minutes stand approved by consent. And I'll just briefly pause at this point and note for the record that the last meeting of the board was actually held on December 12th and 13, 2017 in Annapolis. That was our semi-annual joint meeting with the Mid-Atlantic Council. While many of us have gotten very used to the process of bouncing back and forth between the Commission's website and the Council's website to track our decision-making process, I think it would be helpful moving forward to begin adding the links to those meetings to the Commission's website so we have a readily accessible chronological record of our proceedings, whether they be board-only meetings such as today or joint board-council meetings as occurs at least twice a year, and have them all sort of live in one place. So I just would like to sort of offer that up and ask perhaps Caitlin and Kirby to coordinate with Tina, reach out to the Mid-Atlantic staff and see if that's doable. Thank you. Just a suggestion there to kind of help keep things centralized. That brings us to our next item on the agenda, which is public comment. Is there any, first of all, we had a sign-up list. No one has signed up. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment, address the board on any issue that is not on our agenda today? Seeing no hands, we will move on to our next item, which is Addendum 30 for final approval. This is a final action item. It's Addendum 30 to the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass FMP, which addresses Black Sea Bass recreational management in 2018. And just quickly, before we launch into our review and consideration, I really want to credit the REC working group and the board for having the foresight to develop some new and innovative approaches for consideration, and to the public for their many substantive and really helpful comments through the public hearing and public comment process. The public hearings I saw were very well attended up and down the coast, and I really think I speak for everyone here in offering our appreciation to the many folks who offered comments on this draft addendum, and certainly to Caitlin, our new FMP coordinator, who really has done an awesome job keeping things on track and managing a pretty hefty portfolio. So thank you for all of that. Here's how we plan to proceed. First, Caitlin will review the options as set forth in the draft addendum and the public comment summary. We don't have a TC report, although it's indicated on the agenda, but Caitlin will offer some brief comments on the process used by the technical committee to develop the example measures in the draft addendum. That's really the sole focus, if you will, of that item. Caitlin will then present the AP report on the draft addendum, and we'll then proceed with final decisions, moving forward on an issue-by-issue basis. I do not plan to allow for additional public comments since that opportunity has already been provided. The only stipulation would be if a motion is considered that deviates substantively from the options set forth in the draft, which I don't anticipate. As such, we would not be entertaining additional public comment today. With that, Caitlin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll jump right in and get us going on this. So I'll be presenting on Draft Addendum 30 for board review. And to give you an outline of my presentation, I'll start with the timetable for the document's development, highlight some of the changes that have been made since the public comment period, then provide an overview of the public comment, give a quick refresher on the document's background, and then review the proposed management options in the addendum and summarize the public comments on those options. And then before I take questions, I'll provide the advisory panel report and outline the board's next steps on the addendum. And I know we have a lot to go through today, so if we can hold questions until the end, I think that would help us keep moving smoothly. So the board initiated this addendum in May of 2017, and then the document was developed over the course of the year by the Recreational Working Group and PDT. And the board approved the draft addendum for public comment at the December 2017 joint ASMFC-MAFMC meeting. And following the approval of the draft addendum, it went out for public comment from December 22nd through January 22nd. And during this period, the public comments were submitted and gathered at state public hearings. And the comments are provided in the supplemental materials, and I'll also be including summaries of those in my presentation. So now we're at the juncture where the board will consider the addendum for approval and take final action on the document. So before I get into the overview of the document and public comments, I want to point out those changes that have been made to the document since public comment. There have been a few minor changes. If you look at the tables in Appendix 1 of the addendum, you'll see they've been updated. And the first reason for these updates was to correct an error found in the 2006 harvest estimates in the MRIP data that were being used to calculate the regional allocations proportional to harvest. So when this error was corrected and the actual 2006 MRIP data were included, the regional allocations in all of those tables changed very slightly by less than 1% in all of the cases. So now in these tables, you will see the updated information highlighted in yellow with the old values in parentheses for comparison. The other update made was to the number of season days given in the example measures in tables B1 and B2 for the northern region, and this update was just to reflect the most current projections for harvest in 2017 based on Wave 5 data, as previously they only included Wave 4 data. So now all the tables in the appendix are updated through Wave 5 with those example measures. And to show you an example of how to read this, this is Table A1 as it's currently presented in the document, and all of the tables that have been updated are highlighted in this format, so you can see the percent change in allocation and the resulting change in the allocation in pounds in yellow, and all of the other updates, again, are in the same format. So as I mentioned, the public comment period was open from December 22nd to January 22nd, and during the period of public comment, there were hearings held in 8 jurisdictions, including all of the states in the management unit except New Hampshire and North Carolina. In total, 111 people were estimated to attend the hearings, and 87 provided comments at these hearings. We also received 54 total written comments, which included 1 form letter signed by 12 individuals, 8 letters from organizations, and 34 comments from individual stakeholders, including charter boat owners and operators, private anglers, and concerned citizens. So as I review the management options in the document in a few slides, I will also be summarizing the comments that are specific to each of the sections or options. And then at the end, I'll summarize some of the more general comments received on the addendum. All right, so I'll move into a quick review of the document and proposed management options, starting with some background information. So as you'll recall, the addendum was initiated in response to several challenges in recreational black sea bass management over the last several years related to inequities in harvest reductions and accountability for the effectiveness of regulations. And under the FMP, the recreational fishery for black sea bass is managed on a target quota basis, where a set portion of the total allowable landings every year is established as in a recreational harvest limit, or RHL, and the states then establish their management measures that are expected to collectively achieve this RHL every year. So from 1996 to 2010, to achieve the coastwide RHL, there was one set of coastwide management measures being used, and this became viewed as problematic due to some differences in the stock, fish size, and fishing interests along the coast, and disproportionate impacts to the states within the management unit. So therefore, the board approved a series of addenda which allowed for some more state-by-state flexibility, beginning in 2011 with Addendum 21, which allowed the states to individually craft the recreational measures to constrain harvest to the RHL. And then an ad hoc regional management approach was used from 2012 to 2017. And under this approach, the northern region states have been subject to harvest reductions in most years, and the southern states have largely remained status quo, keeping their measures consistent with the federal measures. So also during these years of state-by-state and ad hoc regional management, the constant catch approach was being used to set coastwide catch limits from 2010 to 2016 because there was not a peer-reviewed and accepted stock assessment for management use. So the lack of information on the black sea bass stock made it a little difficult to manage the resource, and the mismatch between the constant catch limit and the actual stock status resulted in states continually having to reduce measures. And under ad hoc regional management, the states had some flexibility in reducing their measures with state-specific adjustments to their regulations, but this also raised some concerns about the equity and accountability in constraining harvest to the coastwide catch limits. So all of these concerns led to the motion in May of 2017 to develop alternative approaches for regional management via an addendum so that states in a region would have some more consistency and in their measures and their catch limits based on geographic differences in the stock and the fishery. And as a reminder, the most current information on the black sea bass stock from the 2016 benchmark stock assessment indicates that as of 2015, the spawning stock biomass is well above the target, and the fishing mortality was also estimated to be below the target, so the stock is not overfished and overfishing is not occurring. However, a challenge is that we don't have as much information about the new year classes that will be coming into the exploitable portion of the biomass. So we should have an assessment in 2019 to give us some more information on the stock's trajectory. All right, so I'll now start going through the management options that are presented in the document. And as you'll remember, there are two proposed management programs, option 3.1.1 for coastwide measures and option 3.1.2 for regional allocation of the RHL. Under regional allocation, there are 6 additional decision points, which are shown up here, that I'll go through individually over the next several slides. So as I go through each of these management options, I'll also be summarizing the public comments that are specific to each one. And after each of the decision points in the document, I'll provide summaries on those comments that were more general in nature. So option 3.1.1 would be to use the default management program under the original FMP, and this would require one set of coastwide management measures for recreational black sea bass, and all states would have to follow the same set of measures. And as you might have seen in the memo provided in supplemental materials, the Council proposed but did not approve federal backstop measures at the December joint meeting as follows. They were 14 inches in minimum size, 5 fish in possession limit, and a season from May 15th to September 15th. And while these measures have not been approved by the Board and Council, they were analyzed by the Council staff and TC members and are projected to result in a recreational harvest of 3.62 million pounds compared to the 2018 RHL of 3.66 million pounds. So in this case, the Board could consider these measures as de facto coastwide measures under the coastwide management option. So following the discussion on this addendum, the Board will also need to take action on these federal measures. And also note that the 2 states participating in the February fishery, North Carolina and Virginia, would be required to further reduce their measures to account for their Wave 1 harvest. So the second option is regional allocation of the RHL, and again, under this management option, there are 6 additional decision points that would need to be defined by the board. So there's the basis for allocation, the regional alignment, the time frame used to specify the allocation, the consistency of measures within a region, the process for evaluation and specification, and the time frame for the addendum to stay in place. So public comments on the management program overwhelmingly supported the regional allocation option. Only one commenter supported coast-wide measures. And the comments included that it's difficult to offer meaningful comments on the choice between coast-wide and regional management when there were no actual or proposed coast-wide measures provided, which, as you'll remember, at the time there were no coast-wide measures provided as examples for that option. Another comment mentioned that regional management would be more reasonable for all the states than coast-wide measures would be. That regional allocation provides an opportunity to rationalize black sea bass management, and that it's more logical because the fisheries in different states and regions are quite different. So there are also several comments that the addendum should have included an option for state-by-state management, as the original motion suggested. The next decision point, which is the first decision point under regional allocation, is section 3.1.2.1, basis for allocation, and there are 2 alternatives. Under option A, only the average historical harvest data would be used to determine the proportion of the RHL allocated to each region, and option B would require a 3-region alignment where the northern states would be Massachusetts through New York, and then New Jersey would constitute a standalone region, and then the southern region would include Delaware through North Carolina north of Cape Hatteras. And just note that if this option is selected, this is the only regional alignment possible under the next section. So under this option, the allocation of the RHL would be calculated using a combination of exploitable biomass and historical harvest information. The first step would initially allocate the RHL between the north and the south, split at the Hudson Canyon. So the New Jersey would be included in the south at first. And then this would be based on a time series average of the exploitable biomass produced from the 2016 benchmark stock assessment. And then the New Jersey would be proportioned out of the southern region using their proportional historical harvest compared to Delaware through North Carolina. And the exploitable biomass estimate is derived from recreational catch per angler and a catchability coefficient Q. So when you divide recreational catch per angler by Q, you scale it to biomass for each of those regions. The majority of the comments on this section received, supported option B, which is the allocation based on exploitable biomass and harvest. And the comments in support included that the exploitable biomass option has merit, but it needs further development, and also that it is good to incorporate information on the shifting distribution of biomass into, in the black sea bass stock into management. And some supporters of either of these 2 options commented that their preference was because it would allow them to get more liberal measures in their state. The next decision point is the regional alignment, and in the document there are 3 options. A, 2 regions with Massachusetts through New Jersey and Delaware through North Carolina. And then B, 3 regions, Massachusetts through New York as 1, New Jersey as a standalone region, and Delaware through North Carolina as the 3rd. And C, 4 regions, Massachusetts and Rhode Island as 1 region, Connecticut and New York as a 2nd, New Jersey again as a standalone, and Delaware through North Carolina as the 4th. And again, note that option B, 3 regions, is the only option available to go with the exploitable biomass option in the previous section. For regional alignment, the majority of the comments supported option B, 3 regions, and many of the supporters of B preferred it by default because they supported the option for allocation based on exploitable biomass and historical harvest. And it was also commented that it's the best option for New Jersey to be in its own region due to their differences in measures and harvest from both the north and the south. And the 2-region option was the second most supported option, and supporters of this option commented that more states in a region would result in better estimates and lower PSEs for the MREP regional harvest estimates, and that New Jersey and New York having different measures would result in some unfair competition. The 3rd decision point is the time frame for specifying the regional allocation. Option A is a 10-year time frame from 2006 to 2015, and option B is a 5-year time frame from 2011 to 2015. The comments on these timeframes overall, the preferences for the 5-year timeframe outnumber the preferences for the 10-year timeframe, but not by much, and there is a notable split between the northern and southern states on which options they support. So the supporters of the 5-year timeframe commented that it's more reflective of the current distribution of the resource and the increased abundance of black sea bass in the northern states. And that since the 2011 recruitment, the fishery has changed drastically with a significant increase of abundance of black sea bass, and that it would result in a longer season for the northern states. And then supporters of option A, the 10-year time frame, commented that the longer time period provides a more historical average, which accounts for the northward shifts in biomass in recent years, and that using the 5-year time frame would be unfair to New Jersey and southern states because of the mandatory harvest cuts and lower catch limits that were occurring in that time frame. And that finally, the 10-year time frame results in more liberal measures for the southern states. All right, next decision point is the consistency of measures within the regions. Option A would be for all the states in a region to have uniform measures, but note that the participation of 2 states in the February fishery, again, North Carolina and Virginia, will remove the possibility of having truly uniform measures within some regions. So option B is to have a regulatory standard for a set of measures within a region with conservation equivalency allowed. And the states within the region would be allowed to deviate minimally from that standard by 1 inch in size limit, 3 fish in possession limit, and 30 days in total season length. Public comments overall indicated a greater preference for option B, which is the regulatory standard with CE. However, many commented that that more flexibility should be allowed in these CE restrictions because of seasons that occur at different times in the year based on the resource availability, and many felt the 30-day time limit of difference is not enough to account for these differences. Some other comments included that this option would be necessary for Delaware through North Carolina because Virginia and North Carolina are participating in the February fishery while the other states are not, and that each state should have the freedom to craft their regulations appropriate regulations for their fishery without concern for the surrounding states. Our 5th decision point is related to the process for evaluating and specifying measures. So the first choice is to use essentially our status quo process of annually setting regional measures and evaluating regional harvest against the RHL. And the second choice is to instead set regional measures to try and achieve the RHL, but to then evaluate regional harvest performance based on the recreational ACL, or the annual catch limit. So for example, in 2017, the 2017 harvest would be used to set the regional measures to achieve the 2018 RHL, and then in 2019, the measures would be specified based on performance of the 2018 fishery relative to the ACL. So this would be looking at catch, which includes harvest and discards. And if the coastwide ACL is not exceeded in the previous year, the states may demonstrate that maintaining current measures or liberalizing will constrain their catch to the ACL in the following year. And if the ACL were exceeded, the catch would then be evaluated against a 3-year moving average of the ACL. So for example, if 2019 catch is over the ACL, then the catch would be compared to a time series average 3 years of the ACL. And if it's over that average, then the region would have to reduce their recreational measures. And because this option does involve some better needs for discard information, the states would develop proposals to implement improved data collection and compliance from both private anglers and state-only permitted for hire vessels, which recreationally target black sea bass. So these proposals would need to demonstrate that by 2020, significant improvements would be achieved in these 5 different areas. So biological sampling, reduction in refusal rates of MRIP intercept surveys, discard and composition information, reduction in discarding, and improved angler compliance. All of those who commented on this option supported option B, adjusting measures to the ACL, and reasons for this included that this opportunity to provide additional discard information to show the differences in mortality rates among the states would be beneficial, and also that status quo hasn't seemed to hit the right mark, so maybe this approach would. And I'll also note that at the hearings, many members of the public were hesitant to comment on this due to their lack of understanding on how this ACL option would work in practice. And there was a general feeling that the details of this option need to be further defined. So it was mentioned also in the document that the document should not refer solely to overages, but also include examples of underages when evaluating the harvest to the RHL or the ACL. So our last of the decision points under regional allocation is the time frame for the addendum provisions. And our choices in the document would either allow the addendum provisions to stay in place for either up to 2 or up to 3 years. So after 2018, the board could vote to extend the management program as specified in the addendum for either 1 or 2 years, expiring at the end of 2019 or 2020. And overall, in the public comments, there was more support for option B, addendum provisions in place for up to 3 years. And the comments on this were that it would make it easier to extend the addendum if it was working well, and it would reduce administrative burden. And some comments for the 2-year option included that the addendum is unfair and should be replaced as soon as possible, and also that new information from upcoming stock assessments should be incorporated into management as soon as possible. So there were also 14 commenters in Rhode Island that requested the addendum only stay in place for 1 year. All right, so those are all the specific management options and comments on those options, and these are some additional comments that are more general about the addendum. So there were a large number of people who indicated that season length is an extremely important factor for the for-hire sector, and they're looking to have the longest season they can. There were also some comments that the for-hire sector should be a separate category within this addendum, and that they should have different measures from private anglers because they account for a smaller proportion of the recreational harvest coastwide. There were also multiple comments expressing concern that the document's not explicit enough when it comes to regional and state accountability, so it needs to be more clear how the states and regions would be actually held accountable for their harvest. Also, comments were made on the distrust in the MRIP data being used for management and in mortality estimates, and also the management system for recreational black sea bass in general. Many commenters also mentioned that current and proposed management is too restrictive considering the large stock biomass. A couple of individuals brought up opposition to mid-season closures specifically. And finally, various commenters felt it was difficult to comment on this addendum considering the uncertainties in harvest estimates and measures resulting from the options. So thank you for bearing with me through the overview of the document and the public comments. As Bob noted, our TC chair is not here to give a report on the addendum, so if there are questions on the specific work done by the TC on the example measures provided, I can attempt to answer those at the end, but first I'll quickly summarize the AP report on this document. So our advisory panel met via conference call to review draft addendum 30 on January 25th, and 9 advisors provided feedback on the options in the addendum. So one advisor from North Carolina preferred the coastwide option and therefore didn't comment on the rest of the options under regional allocation. The other 8 supported regional management and commented on the relevant decision points as follows. 8 of them preferred the harvest-based allocation, option A. 4 preferred the 2-region alignment, 1 preferred 3-region alignment, and 2 preferred 4 regions. 8 of the advisors preferred a 5-year time frame. 7 preferred a regulatory standard with conservation equivalency. 8 preferred adjusting measures to the ACL rather than the RHL. And 5 preferred the addendum stay in place for up to 2 years. So I'll quickly go over the next steps for the board on this addendum. Today, the board will consider draft addendum 30 for final approval and select the addendum provisions within the document. So the first decision point again is to choose a management program, either coastwide versus regional allocation. And then if regional allocation is selected, the board will need to define their provisions under this option. Again, those 6 provisions that I went through today. And if regional management is adopted, regions would then submit proposals for TC review which the board can define when the deadline for those proposals would be. The TC would review those proposals, and then the board would meet via conference call to review the proposals, the TC recommendations, and approve the regional measures. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. Very nicely done. So let's open the floor to questions to Caitlin on any aspect of her presentation, that being anything having to do with the addendum or public comments or the AP report. Mark, did I just see your hand go up? Mark Alexander.
Yes, you did. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Caitlin, was the revised tables in the addendum provided to the AP before they had their discussion? And was their discussion based on the revised tables, or was it based on what the document that was taken out the public hearing?
Thanks, Mark. I don't believe that the AP looked at the revised tables. However, there wasn't discussion on those numbers, and I did, when presenting the document to the AP, indicate that the measures provided in the tables were all examples and subject to change. So there wasn't a whole lot of specific concerns about the measures that were in the tables at the time. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. It's not a question, but a comment. It's been expressed to me, based on some of the people that attended our public hearing, that they expressed their preferences based on what was in the document at the time. Since seeing the revised document, they're very concerned that those preferences they expressed are no longer valid, and that it's very important for the commission to understand that when looking at the summaries that you gave, I think if people had a chance to look at the document as it stands today, and they might reconsider their stance and opt for different preferences. Thank you.
I think that's a very fair comment. I've heard similar comments as well, so thank you for putting that on the record, Mark. Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Caitlin, your last slide talked about the process moving forward after decisions are made today, and I'm not clear as to how we would establish our seasons within regions. Are the representatives of the TC going to have some standard methodology that they'll use in moving forward, and it's just more of a try to get an understanding about what we do after today's meeting when we go home? If you can just clear that up for me, that'd be great.
Thanks, Mike. It's my understanding that the TC would work together to have, if not a standard methodology, and methodologies for each region that are approved by the full TC. So when each region comes forward with their measures that are developed by the TC, that proposal should include the work that was done to come up with those measures, and that work will also be reviewed by the TC. So if it's not accepted or not recommended to be used by the full TC, then they would need to make some revisions to that methodology. Does that answer your question?
Wrong button. So just to build on that a bit, if you'll remember, Mike, at our December meeting, the board did reviewed and approved the TC's memo regarding smoothing approaches that the TC at that point was in the process of developing, wanted to get some direction from the board as to whether they should continue that development process, and then with a view to applying that to the evaluation of performance in 2017, and then of course the work on specifying measures for 2018. So that's very much in play pursuant to the board's approval of that approach in December, and it relates, I think, to your question. I just wanted to add that in. I saw another hand go up. Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Caitlin. Caitlin, were you at the AP meeting, or was it a conference call, I take it? Okay. I guess my question is, I can understand why the public was so enamored with the 5-year approach as overall, although it was split. I understand that. It looked like the AP had 8 votes for that, and my question is, was the AP informed about the results of the benchmark assessment and the information that although the biomass is more of a northerly component, meaning more larger fish north, that the abundance was also much more substantial than previously in the southern area, so south of Hudson Canyon to be specific. Were those types of information presented to the advisory panel?
I presented the document and explained, basically gave the AP the explanation on all of the options in the document that was provided at the public hearings and to the board at the last meeting. So I don't think I went into further detail on how the stock information went into those options, but they did have that information at their disposal before the AP meeting.
Additional questions for Caitlin? Seeing none, that does bring us to our point where we need to take up final decision on the issues that are before us. As reflected by the decision tree provided in the document, namely Appendix 3, there are, and as Caitlin very well described, there are really two paths that the board could take, and those paths are wholly dependent on the first decision point. So the decision is whether to revert back to a default coastwide program subject to a single set of coastwide measures or to proceed with a regional management approach. If the board were to decide to revert back to a default coastwide program, there would be no other issues to consider, and the draft addendum in its entirety would be rendered moot. Alternatively, if the board were to decide to proceed with a regional management program, decisions would be made, need to be made on the issues that Caitlin outlined there, and there were 6 of them. So with that, I'm going to open the floor to a motion on the first overarching issue, which is whether to adopt option 3.1.1, default coastwide measures, or option 3.1.2, regional allocation of the RHL. Would anyone like to make a motion to that effect? Dr. Pierce.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the regional approach is the way to go. And along with our having a regional approach, there's a need for us to follow through with what the organization, with what the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission has decided to do, not just for black sea bass, but for the whole suite of species along the Atlantic coast, and that is to address changes in distribution and abundance of these different stocks. And we have some options, of course, before us that speak to that particular issue about change distribution and what should we do with that understood. I'm influenced by the fact that we have the latest assessment on black sea bass, indicating that about 87% of the black sea bass resource is found from New York to Massachusetts, and that's a change from the way it used to be. And ostensibly, it's because of ocean warming, changes in distribution. So, because this addendum has an option that also provides for an ability for us to revisit that assumption about change distribution if new information is brought forward. For example, if suddenly there are new year classes appearing, and after the assessment is done in future years, we see that the distribution has changed somewhat, no longer to the north, but more to the south, we can go back to that particular discussion about how the resource should be reallocated. So the document provides, the addendum provides a great deal of excellent explanation as to why we should be dealing now with changes in distribution of the biomass, exploitable biomass specifically, and at the same time not ignoring the fact that we do need to consider historical harvest. And so I'm very glad to see that we have this option that does deal with exploitable biomass and historical harvest. So with that said, I'll make a motion to adopt under section 3.1.2.1 option B, regional allocation based on exploitable biomass and historical harvest, and under regional alignment, section 3.1.2.2, option B, 3 regions. So that is my motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for that, and I will wait for Jess to see if she can get that up on the board. And as she's getting it up on the board, I do think we might need to preface your motion with, in a sense, you jumped, I think, the first step, but I think in a way that's very easy to amend, and that would be to start out your motion with a move to adopt 3.1.2 regional management, and then the rest would follow, meaning, just to sort of acknowledge, I think, in the way that I feel we might need to for the record, that we're taking the regional management approach, and then pursuant thereto, the rest of your motion, I think, follows very well. So that's my suggestion, just to kind of keep things, and I'll wait, Dr. Pierce, to see if you concur with this, but Jess, I would suggest prefacing this, meaning at the very beginning of this motion, if you could add, adopt 3.1.2 regional management, and then the rest would follow. And then
that does make a great deal of sense. It's more to the point, so I agree with you that that's a refinement that I find very acceptable.
Thank you for that. So let's just make sure we've got it up on the board, and I'll read it, and then I'll look for a second. Move to adopt option 3.1.2, regional management. I would suggest adding and under section 3.1.2.1, option B, regional allocation based on exploitable biomass and historical harvest, and under section 3.1.2.2, option B, 3 regions. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Mike Luisi. So the motion has been made and seconded, and it is before the board for discussion. Discussion on the motion. I'll start with Ray Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Should the 3 regions be so stipulated in this motion?
I believe it's properly characterized in that there's only one 3-region approach in the document, and it's the 3-region approach that Caitlin indicated. So I feel that it's clear enough as indicated. Do you concur, Caitlin? Yes. Okay, so I think thank you for that, Ray, but I think we're good. Emily, Gilbert, did I see your hand up?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add, for the sake of transparency, that we're going to be abstaining from all of these votes, since these are really allocative decisions amongst the states. All of these alternatives are meeting the catch requirements in the regulations. So I just want to make that clear so people know.
Thank you for that. I saw another hand, and I'll start with Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. Under option 3.1.2.1, option B, New Jersey will be treated under historical harvest, and the other 2 regions will be treated differently. Is that correct?
Yes, it's essentially a hybrid approach, and it has to do with the fact that you can only split into 2 regions, north and south of the Hudson. New Jersey would have been in the southern region, but because the board did not include an option with New Jersey in the southern region, there needed to be some other way to address the issue with regard to New Jersey. Therefore, historical harvest is used in this option for New Jersey to essentially peel them out of the southern region and provide them with a standalone allocation. So it is a hybrid approach. It is based on exploitable biomass, but given New Jersey's position as a straddling state, if you will, there was a need to try to formulate this option in a way that was the only way doable. I'll just say it that way. Go ahead, Eric.
I just have a question about the future. What happens when we have the MRIP data that gets recalibrated in a few months? What's that going to do to the action we're doing today? Anybody have any clue what that might look like?
I see Tony Kern's hand up.
So what will happen is we'll get information with the new MRIP information sometime late summer, early fall. That information will be worked into a stock assessment come 2019, early 2019. And then we'll have an updated stock assessment based on that. Until we have the updated stock assessment and quota numbers based on the revised assessment and the revised MRIP numbers, we will calibrate the recreational data back to the old process so that we're comparing sort of apples to apples and to make sure that we're staying within the RHL and not using data that's different than how we calculated the original RHL. So does that answer your question?
Eric?
Yeah, I'm sure the answer is a lot longer than that, I'm thinking, but I'm going to make a motion to amend. I don't like the fact that in option B that two regions are treated separately than another, so my motion would be to amend to delete option 3.1.2.1 option B and substitute 3.1.2.1 option A.
I'm going to wait till Jess gets that up, and we'll make sure it's clear, and then I'll look to see if there's a second. So whether it's a motion to amend or substitute, right now it's being written as a motion to substitute option 3.1.2.1, option A. So I think is that clearly written enough? Okay, well, we're still working on it. Okay, so now it's still being written, but I'm going to read slowly. Move to amend to substitute option 3.1.2.1, option A, regional allocation based on historical harvest, for option B, regional allocation based on exploitable biomass and historical harvest. So there were essentially three parts to the first motion. This would substitute the second part as I read it. Is there a second to this motion to amend, or to substitute, I should say? Seeing no hands, the motion fails for lack of a second. And we're back to the original motion. Discussion on the original motion. Mike Louisi, okay. Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can support the motion. The sort of eloquent information presented by Dr. Pierce. I hope as we go forward, we always remember that abundance in this situation is not the same as biomass. And I'll leave it at that for right now, but certainly that's been something I've been harping on for about a year, that, we do have some abundance in the southern region, and albeit biomass depends on the size of fish as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mark Alexander, did you want to add additional comment? I saw your hand up before.
I'll wait till the underlying motion's voted on.
Thank you. Additional comments on the motion? David Borden.
Just a question and a comment. The question is, once it kind of follows up on Eric's question, once we get the MRIP data, and as Tony characterized, then they're going to do a updated stock assessment in 2019, correct?
We're going to be talking about this at the end of the meeting, but right now, I believe there is an operational assessment update scheduled for 2019, yes.
Okay, but the last time we got together with the Mid-Atlantic Council, there was some discussion of doing a framework or an amendment to the plan at that point, once we get that. So all of this am I thinking of this correctly? All of this may be subject to change depending upon the decisions that are made the next year or two, correct? Even though we might agree to 2 or 3 years here, there's a potential to change this.
I think the potential is absolutely there that things could change over the next year or two, absolutely.
Okay. And then the second point is basically this issue of managing based on exploitable biomass at the Mid-Atlantic Council, joint Mid-Atlantic Council meeting. I expressed support for that concept. But I would just note to everybody, don't look at these tables and think, I'm a winner or I'm a loser. You can be the opposite in a couple of years. In other words, if you pick that alternative, exploitable biomass, subject to change as the biomass changes. So I would hope people would look at it that way and not think of it, well, right now I lose and therefore I'm not going to support this. That all may change. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I obviously support the motion, given that I seconded it, but I just wanted to clarify kind of where we stand regarding process, but given the questions that have been raised. I spoke with Brandon, with council staff just a while ago, and he explained to me that we currently do not have 2019 specifications on the books. That will be something that we'll discuss at our August joint meeting in setting those specifications. At that time, we will not have an updated assessment, but I know we're going to talk about this at the end of the meeting. The assessment schedule, based on NRCC discussions, has put the black sea bass operational MRIP assessment in early 2019, possibly spring of 2019. If we were to be able to get the Science Center to move on that assessment as quickly as they can in 2019, any influence on quota that would come from a recommendation by the Council's SSC could be made and adjusted for the 2019 season. So while we are currently today looking at a recommendation from the SSC on a reduced 2019 quota for black sea bass, it is very possible that based on the updated assessment that adjustments can be made to the 2019 quota that would filter through and carry into the allocations that we're planning to set.
Thank you for that, Mike. And it is true, we do plan to circle back to that very discussion at the end of this meeting. It's an important issue. Additional discussion on the motion that's before the board. Mark Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Within this motion, we're weighing basically against the coast-wide option, and just for making a fully informed decision, was an example measures for coast-wide measures ever calculated since the addendum document was presented at public hearings?
The short answer is a de facto coast-wide measure is available via the backstop measure that was developed by Mid-Atlantic Council staff and analyzed and found to be within the RHL. So and that was presented by Caitlin. We could put it back up if you want. So, and it's in a memo in the meeting materials. So there is a representative coast-wide measure that's available to the board for consideration that has been analyzed and could well be considered as the alternative to this approach.
Is that backstop the precautionary default? Is that what?
I think it's no. The short answer is no, because precautionary default is intended to be that hammer that is held, and this is, and it's apparently up on the board now. This is intended to be just what it is, and that is a set of measures that would achieve the RHL if applied on a coast-wide basis.
Thank you.
Further discussion on the motion, and we'll make sure that's back up before the board before we take the vote. Is the board ready for the question? If so, 30-second caucus, and then we'll vote on this. Barely a murmur, so I'm going to take that to mean the board is ready to vote. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Thank Thank you, hands down. No votes? Abstentions? There are 3 abstentions. Thank you. Any null votes? The motion passes 8-0 with 3 abstentions. Thank you. The next issue, and maybe Caitlin, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just putting up to make sure the board's clear on the 2 options. The next issue would be time frame for specifying allocation. There are 2 options, and although I'm sure they're clear, it might be helpful to just put them up there. Option A would be 2006 through 2015. Option B would be 2011 through 2015. So 10-year versus 5-year. And at this time, I would entertain a motion on that issue. Eric Reed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to adopt option 3.1.2.3, option B, which is 2011 through 2015.
We'll get that up, but it's obviously clear in terms of what the motion is. So with that, I'll ask, is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Dr. Pierce. So moved by Eric Reed and seconded by Dr. Pierce to adopt option B under section 3.1.2.3, which is the 2011 through 2015 timeframe. Discussion on the motion. Adam Nowalski.
Thank you. Allocation's never easy. When we go back to Addendum 21, this started out very specifically talking about shares. We shied away from the use of the word allocation through an addendum process. But nevertheless, due to changes in the fishery, due to what the management process has unfortunately resulted in management measures, here we are. However, we're talking about what has really driven this fishery in recent years is a 2011 year class. And to go ahead and essentially use this 5-year time frame to make an allocation decision based primarily on a single year class, I can't imagine another species that this management body would make that decision on. To say this is a year class and we're going to use that for allocation. I can't even fathom that. At the joint meeting, New Jersey had tried to put forth a third option, a 2006 to 2010 timeline. That was rejected at the time, and in hindsight, it kind of didn't adequately capture the impacts of the 2011 year class, so I understand the reason for rejection at that time. But this motion is essentially the flip side of it. Really relies on only the 2011 year class for making this allocation decision. To that end, I believe that the 2006 to 2015 10-year option is something that is fair and reasonable in terms of incorporating what an allocation decision should be based on, a combination of history and current conditions. And I think to Mr. Borden's point is, based on what we're doing with this CPA approach, this could all look very different in a short amount of time. To that end, I move to substitute option A, the 2006 to 2015 10-year time frame.
So there's a second by John Clark. So we have a motion to substitute option A, 2006 through 2015, 10-year time frame, moved by Mr. Nowalski, seconded by Mr. Clark. I'm going to go back to Eric Reed because it was my fault. I should have actually started with him as the maker of the initial motion. So now I'm sensing that Mr. Reed may be wishing to speak in opposition to the substitute. Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, allocation is always a tough decision. You know, the AP had some information available to them, whether they used it or not. You know, to Mr. O'Reilly's question earlier, I'm not really sure, but they were 8 to 9 or 8 to 1 for this option. I would support that opinion. And generally speaking, the biomass is trending north and east, and this time frame will take that into account. And I mean, to me, ignoring those points, would cause a bigger disconnect between management and reality, higher angular frustration, and higher discards.
Let me go back because I have a sense there's going to be differences of opinion on this. So I'll alternate between those supporting the substitute and those opposing it. We just heard from one who opposes it. Who would like to speak in favor of the substitute? Rob O'Reilly?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I've been in that camp for quite a while. If the board will remember, I had requested that we look at 2001 to 2010 data as also one of the frames that we would have for going forward here. Unfortunately, that data for North Carolina, at least for a few years there, was not available, so staff could not do that analysis. However, I can tell you, and I know that you don't want me to belabor this, but looking at what's occurred from 2006 to 10 compared to 2011 to 15 should be fairly obvious. Every state from New Jersey to North Carolina, the average harvest from 2006 to 2010 underwent a substantial decline in the 2011 to 15. And the converse is true for states above New Jersey. So how do we level all this? And Adam had a nice explanation as to what we really are looking at in the future here by relying on one strong year class. And I looked at this whole situation when the assessment was done, that it did offer the abundance hope that we would be closer to the way things were below New York in the coming few years. That's the way I viewed the assessment, and as a matter of fact, I asked that question directly to Gary Shepard, and he was at pains to say, listen, it's, fish move, essentially. It's not as if all this data doesn't mean that fish weren't moving back and forth to some extent, but there is a abundance that has increased in the southern area. Maybe it's not going to be the big fish that everyone would like, but the abundance is there. So for that reason, I certainly support the 10-year time frame, and thank you very much.
Anyone wishing to speak in opposition? John Maniscalco.
The 10-year time frame doesn't reflect the current state of the fishery. The state of Connecticut in the last 2 years is the second largest recreational black sea bass harvester in the 4-state northern region. Going back to 2006 up to sometime in the early 2010s, they had no fishery. So to adopt a time series that completely ignores the fact that the fishery has changed so drastically that some states that used to harvest fish in the tens of thousands is now harvesting them in the many hundreds of thousands, is ignoring the vast impact that would have and the equity issue that would have on the North, which has, over the same time series, while the southern states remained at 12.5 inches, 200 days, a bag limit of 15 to 25 fish, has cut their seasons to no spring season or no fall season, 3 to 5 fish when the majority of anglers have access to the fishery, and continue to harvest the vast majority of fish on the coast, even at 15 inches. Thank you.
Thank you. In support of the substitute? John Clark.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to what Adam and Rob said. Just think it's a good compromise. It accounts for the full history of this fishery, and I think it's fair to both regions.
Thank you. Dr. Pierce?
Yeah, I don't support the motion to substitute. I support the original motion. As noted already, the advisory panel was nearly unanimous in supporting the shorter time frame. They said the fishery is changing very fast, and they have said that it's very different from beyond 5 years ago. Our focus should be on change in distribution of this resource, and the first motion that was adopted, got to that particular point. I'll emphasize as well that biomass started shifting to the north before the 2011 year class. We're not talking just about the 2011 year class. It's more than that. Because the assessment spoke to that particular issue. So it's not just that year class. And as I indicated before, if indeed we see a change in the distribution again because of incoming year classes for whatever reason, then we can again go back to a reconsideration of the shift of the distribution and modify depending upon whatever new distribution there may be. But frankly, I don't see that new distribution coming. I think we have gone down a path towards a shift, and that shift is going to continue into the future, even more so than right now. So, so again, that's why I firmly believe that using the most recent 5 years is the sensible way to go.
Thank you. Mark Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't reiterate what John Manasalco said, but it's true. Our harvest has increased dramatically. The abundance index in our trawl survey has increased dramatically, but that increase has only been over the past 4 or 5 years. Like John said, we had almost no harvest in Connecticut prior to that. The second thing is, in choosing option B, the board has wanted to take this in a new direction so that current abundance is reflected in how we approach management. I think the shorter time series is more consistent with that approach, and for that reason, I'll oppose the motion to substitute. In addition, in the tables that would result from either the choice of the motion to substitute or the original motion, under the motion to substitute, the spread between the change that would have to occur in the harvest between the 2017 harvest and 2018 allocation, for the motion to substitute, that spread is about 37%. If you use the 5-year time frame, that spread is only about 7 or 8%. So the shock to management would be a little more equitable if we oppose a substitute motion. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for pointing out that there are tables in the back of this addendum which right now help to kind of clarify the decision, if you will, that is before the board, and that is essentially a decision between table B1 and B2. With that, David Borden, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the logic presented by the people that have spoken in favor of option B. I think there's a compelling logic for picking that timeline. Now, having said that, the difficulty, and having gone through this a number of times in this venue, these types of decisions are always gnarly because we end up making winners and losers. To the extent that you pick item B, it disadvantages to some extent the Mid-Atlantic states. If you pick alternative A, it disadvantages the New England states, and then really flies in the face of the logic of what both the board and the commission have been talking about in terms of recognizing the impacts of climate change and trying to make our allocations a little bit more flexible. So having said that, I would just throw this out. We have the flexibility as far as I'm concerned. We have two options. We could make 50% of the option, the allocation based on option A and 50% of the allocation based on option B. That would not sway the allocations in any one direction. There would be benefits to both sides. Both sides would win something, both sides would lose something. So I just throw that out as a concept.
Thank you. Additional comments? Yes, Chris Patsevich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of the comments that I would have said have been said already. In terms of which is the better one, obviously depends on where you are on the coast. I think the thing that concerns me about the 5-year is it does capture the most recent state of where we are. And we can look at this again. But I think if we could end up getting ourselves into we're just constantly changing the base allocations every few years because we want the most recent years, and we lose some stability that we try to achieve in the recreational regulations. The extreme case we deal with. A small base allocation is 1998 for the recreational summer flounder fishery, which is brought up many times at this board, where it was just 1 year, and with even though we're looking at a 5-year time frame for 11 to 15, and there's more than just the 2011 year class involved. The 2011 year class influences that pretty heavily. So with that, I lean towards supporting the 10-year just to smooth things out. What David Warden said actually is also appealing too. If that's something that we could do today, if that was something where we just couldn't agree, if that would split the difference and maybe smooth things out for both the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions. But anyways.
Thank you. Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've been inclined over the past years to, and I always urge when we have allocation discussions to include some historical basis for that discussion or for that allocation decision. And I would typically be inclined to go forward with the longer time series. I've yet to decide how I would vote in this case, and I hope there'll be a few more comments to give me a few more minutes to think about how I'll do that. But when I look at the tables, the thing that bothers me with the shorter time period, and while I understand it is most reflective of the current status of the stock, when I look at the column of percent change from 2017 to the 2018 allocation, I'm just troubled in the fact that one particular state within the southern region would be impacted as greatly as those numbers indicate. And when I compare the shorter time series to the longer time series, to me, and not considering our region, which would be looking at a liberalization there, but the reflection of a reduction, this seems, in my mind, to be more balanced under the longer time series. Now, I do want to just point out, too, that the concept that David brought up regarding the splitting of the baby, I guess you would say, or not, or somehow merging the two allocations together and coming up with a hybrid. We've already hybridized the concepts that we're going forward with. That would be interesting to see I think we can all just do the math in our heads, determining if you take a northern region allocation of a little over 2 million pounds, and then under one time series, and then 2.4 million pounds under another, you split the difference there and move forward. I'd be interested in seeing what the board would think about an alternative like that. Thank you.
Thank you, and I believe we're starting to go around with our second round of comments, which is fine, but I'm going to try and hold it to just 2 each. So I see a bunch of hands. I think Matt has yet to comment. I'm going to give everyone a chance to comment twice, and then we're going to need to call the question. Matt?
Hi, thank you. I think the part that bothers me most about the longer time series would be the possibility of creating a mismatch between the availability and the allocation. And I just worry that would set us up for failure to restrain our harvest, like we saw before the last stock assessment, where we had a lot more fish than we thought we had, and we just couldn't live within that allocation. And just the possibility of creating a lot of discards in that case.
Thanks, Matt. Rob O'Reilly?
So I certainly understand that from 2010 up until now, there's been 1 year that the states in the northern region have been able to constrain, to use that word, I don't like that word, but constrain their harvest. So we know that, and we would like to see an end to that. And how do we do that? Because that is important. That bears on any state to have a system where we can not have to always fight against the RHL and not have to be asking questions that were asked several months ago that it's less now, but at one time through 2015 the biomass was very large. Spawning stock biomass was very large. And so we have to get out of the reduction mode somehow. And I don't know what David Borden's premise would look like. It's not a precedent. This is how the spiny dogfish allocation was settled, because there couldn't be a deciding stance on any of the options, and we hybridized options for spiny dogfish back several years ago. So that might be something very good. I would like to see that. I think that's an interesting way to look at this, David. And, I think the southern region already knows it would like, and I'll speak for them and they can tell me not to later, but they would like to sort of be in step as much as they can. Even though this isn't summer flounder where regions were decided, it was sort of de facto region for Delaware to North Carolina, but we all have talked and we would all like to stay somewhat in step. The little wrinkle will be that February fishery, which probably won't be much at all in North Carolina and be a little bit in Virginia, but more or less, that's the way we feel. So any way to not have what I would call a compromise, but to sort of, give a little bit of credence to the longer time period while not sacrificing the way the biomass has shifted would be a very good thing. Thank you.
Thank you. John Maniscalco.
So a couple of things. We'll say the inability of the northern states to constrain harvest occurred while there was a constant catch scenario used to establish harvest limits. That ended once there was an accepted benchmark stock assessment. One of the outputs of that benchmark stock assessment were regional Fs. After bias correction, in 2015, the regional F for the north was well below FMSY. After bias correction for the south, the regional F was above FMSY. So the north, under constant catch, was forced to constrain, or try to constrain harvest, 15-inch size limits, things I've already spoken to, while the south was allowed to remain at 12.5 inches, 200-plus days, and large bag limits. So here we are again, and if I look at these tables, the outcomes of these different regional allocations decision we're about to make is going to what? If we accept or adopt 2006 to 2015, yet another cut for the northern states, the region that is well below FMSY, where at the same time, Delaware through North Carolina will be allowed to liberalize by as much as 36.75%. That doesn't sound like that's sound management. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm trying to go back and forth, but I don't see any hands to the right, so I'm going to stay to the left. Ray Kane.
Yes, I'd like to remind the commission members here at our joint meeting in December with the Mid-Atlantic Council, Brandon Muffy from the Mid-Atlantic Council put a graph up showing a decline in Massachusetts over the past 10 or 12 years. I keep hearing Rob referring to the 10-year timeline, and I was appalled because I know in my state it wasn't because of the lack of abundance of fish. It was because we have been, and I'm going to use the word Rob doesn't want to hear, constrained for that many years in Massachusetts. And I agree with the gentleman from New York with his previous statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam Nowalski.
Would the chair entertain a motion to recess for 5 minutes to discuss this idea that Mr. Borden and Mr. Luisi felt encouraged by of maybe moving some numbers around here to find some middle ground between what appears to be a near evenly split item?
I would. We are recessed until 3 p.m., 6 minutes from now. Thank you. All right, I have to call a 1-minute warning. We need to re-establish the meeting in 1 minute. All right, let's call the meeting, board meeting back we're back in business. After an unexpectedly long recess, but hopefully it was a productive one whereby folks thought through some various options in terms of how to proceed with where we are. So although there is still some work going on in terms of developing some spreadsheet analysis, I do need to look to the board to see how the board wishes to proceed from this point forward. Would anyone like to offer a suggested way forward? We have right now on the board a main motion and a substitute. Is there anyone that would like to offer any suggested way forward, or would otherwise I'd be calling the vote on the substitute motion? That was a long pause where I thought there was going to be a suggested a suggestion for how to move forward, and I don't see any hands going up. So if no hands are going to go up, I'm going to call the question on the substitute. David Borden?
I think the reason there was a long pause there is because I think the expectation is we were going to look at some numbers and see what the impacts were, and then we would talk about the process. I mean, process-wise, to answer your question, I think we've got a couple of options. We could make another motion to substitute. We could table these or postpone these actions or set them aside temporarily and then vote on a different strategy. And if that strategy passes, then basically dispense with the other motion. But I think what people really want to see is the numbers.
I do believe that people are now seeing numbers, having a spreadsheet now appear on the screen. Is there anyone who would like to address this spreadsheet, these numbers that are now up on the screen, to provide the board with some guidance as to what might be an alternative approach? Adam Nowalski.
Again, prior to the break, which I appreciate, the discussion was clearly split, probably just about right down the middle. We saw that in the public comment that was received, split pretty much right down the middle. We've talked a lot this week. We've heard this word compromise, working together. We've dealt with some recent appeals and the challenges of those. I just can't help but think that if we get out of here with something that is more than a 6-4 decision or something, is better for all of us to take home. To take something home because I convinced one more person to vote for me than you did, I just don't think it reflects well on this body. And I think this approach of splitting something here down the middle is a reasonable compromise, is within the spirit that this commission is trying to convey, and I can support this approach moving forward.
I appreciate that sentiment. I would like to have somebody characterize what this approach is. I know there's been talk about a compromise, splitting. and I do see there are some numbers on the board here. I just think it behooves the public who may be listening in right now, and frankly everyone involved in this process, to have somebody offer up a description as to what I sense is a alternative proposal is about, and where these numbers come from, what they mean, and then I would look to somebody to substitute, any board member to offer to substitute, if that's the intent. Otherwise, we're simply looking at right now some numbers, and it looks like somebody did some very good work, but we're in a decision-making mode right now, and we need somebody to offer a way forward in the form of a motion that fully characterizes what it is that is being suggested. Would anyone like to take the lead on that? Adam?
I don't believe I could procedurally amend my own motion. So from a procedural perspective, I would be willing to, with the consent of the board, withdraw my motion to substitute, and at that time, I'll make another motion to substitute with the consent of the board.
Thank you for that suggestion. Is there any objection on the part of the board to withdrawing the substitute motion? Seeing no objection, the substitute is withdrawn. We still have a main motion up on the board, but there is an opportunity to offer a different substitute if anyone would like to offer that. Adam?
I would move that for section 3.1.2.3, a hybrid time series be adopted. A 61.35% allocation to the north, a 38.65% allocation to the south, and then the southern allocation split based on historical harvest between the states of New Jersey and the states of Delaware to North Carolina.
Let me first ask, is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Chris Batsevich. Now, that was obviously a long, but I think well-phrased motion. Do we want to try to get that up there in all of its detail? I think it would be best to try and do that. So staff is working on doing that. So we'll pause very briefly. We're not recessing. We're just going to pause as we make sure that we have that substitute motion correctly and accurately set forth on the board.
So if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to add, based on the average historical harvest, and I believe staff is going to insert those specific percentages as I had used for the north-south split. I believe they have them.
Caitlin has a suggested clarification in terms of the nature of this substitute motion. Caitlin?
Thanks, Bob. I just wanted to note that the work that was done to come up with these proportions isn't from making a new time frame necessarily. That's a hybrid time frame, but rather it's a reorganization of the allocations that were resulting from the two time frames presented previously. So I don't know if the motion needs to be clarified as to that.
Adam?
I'm open to rephrasing it however you think will pass muster. I suspect that if we wanted to go back, we could find some time frame within 2006 to 2015, whether it's 2007 to 2014 or January 30th, 2008 through June 6, 2015, that matches these numbers. So I'll leave it to the discretion of the board chair and staff how best to phrase it.
So let's read what we have right now, and this may be still changing on the fly, and I appreciate everyone's patience in trying to get this right. I think it's very important that we do so. And again, it's still being tweaked, so I'm not going to read it until we have something up there that we feel like we're ready to offer. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start reading it, and I'll certainly look to the board to see whether the language is consistent with the makers, is consistent with what the board feels it should be. Move to substitute for section 3.1.2.3 an averaging of the allocations resulting from the two-time series to be adopted that gives a 61.35% allocation to the north, a 38.65% allocation to the south, and then the southern allocation split based on the average historical harvest between the state of New Jersey, 78.25%, and the states of Delaware to North Carolina, 21.75%. This is in the nature of a substitute motion, which has already been made and seconded. Discussion on this new substitute motion. Mark Alexander.
Does that spreadsheet that was momentarily up on the screen extend those calculations so that we could see what the percent change from 2017 harvest to 2018 allocation would be? Can it? I would really like to make an informed decision here.
Yeah, that's another request of an analysis that has not yet been done yet, which is the challenge of doing decision-making in this way. We're coming up with new proposals that have not been analyzed, and so to your point, Mark, I don't know how difficult that would be, but it has not been done yet. Caitlin is indicating that she's going to give it her best shot, so let's see where we are in a minute or two after we take additional comments. Dr. Pierce.
Yeah, I appreciate the effort to try to come up with something that all could approve, that some have said represents a compromise, and I appreciate that perspective. However, the spreadsheet has just been developed, the calculations have just been done. I appreciate the person who did it. However, I believe that the spreadsheet didn't use input values to 2 decimal places that might have an impact on the final numbers in the table. So again, this is on the fly. I'm uneasy with the calculations. So it makes it hard to to support the motion to substitute.
So, Dr. Pierce, is it your point that in the tables provided in the appendix, the percentages are whole numbers or only out to a single decimal point versus these which extend out to 2 decimal points? And it's therefore not an apples-to-apples type comparison? Is that your concern?
Well, that's my concern. Again, this is an immediate reaction to that which is being brought forward. I'd like to be more deliberative with regards to using numbers in a spreadsheet table. In addition, I'm still wondering how, if this motion to substitute passes, we're going to address biomass distribution changes that we may discover in the next assessment, be it a shift back to the south, which I doubt, or an even greater shift to the north. To me, the path forward is unclear.
Thank you for that. Let me go to Matt first and then Adam.
Hi, yeah, thanks. This whole idea of creating these allocations that based on a long time series, whether it's 10 or 5 or 7 years, it bothers me that we're now going to maybe set these allocations in stone. So I would feel more comfortable if we could amend any motion that we come up with at the end here to require reconsideration of the allocation at the time of the next stock assessment. Whether it be this motion here or if this doesn't pass to go on to the original 5-year one. I think that would address some of the concerns from other partners too. Thanks.
Yeah, Kirby just reminded me, and again, this is the issue that we had punted to the end of the agenda, but it's certainly becoming more and more relevant to the current discussion, and that is, as of right now, there is an operational update scheduled for early in 2019, or in 2019. I think there's an interest in perhaps making that as early as possible. So there is a possibility that there could be new information from an assessment available to this board in 2019, whether that would be early enough to affect specifications and allocations for 2019 or not is certainly a question that remains up in the air. Adam Nowalski.
So to those last 2 points, given that we as a board have made the decision to do allocation through an addendum, we can revisit this. That's how we're choosing to do it. We've been revisiting it virtually every year for the last 7 years, so I don't see that changing. I'll also offer that every other table in Appendix 1, with the exception of the Option B tables, had allocations taken out to 2 decimal places, so I don't think the revised average is a problem here. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional comments on the substitute motion? And I do think we're going to have to try and wrap this as soon as possible, although I realize how consequential this is. We have to try and get to a decision. So I do want to take at least a few more comments if there are some, and then I think we're going to have to call the question. John?
So I appreciate the spirit of compromise involved with putting this option on the table. But I do have issue with the fact that we're in a situation here where there's 4 northern states, and essentially, given the current management structure, the way we've chosen to split up regions because of the way the fisheries occur, northern states will never have the votes to get fair access to the resource. And I don't want that to be lost on anyone here. 4 states, 4 votes, it's never going to do it when there's 10 people sitting around the table. We'll be talking about ACLs in a little while. Northern states are going to take a look at the number of fish they have to work with, and they're going to be forced to make decisions about, oh, do I need to consider going up in size again, going to 16 inches? We're talking about increasing discards just to maintain the fishery we currently have. I'll remind you, New York has no spring. Massachusetts has no fall. 3 fish, 5 fish. And we're going to be further restricting those fisheries. And in order to maintain just what we have, we'll have to be entertaining an increase in size limit and more discards. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a few more comments, but before I do so, Caitlin has, on the fly, done her best, I believe, to calculate the percent changes that this substitute motion would be relative to 2017 harvest, I believe. Caitlin, can you offer that? Thank you.
Yes, it's essentially what's in the column that says percent change from 2017 harvest to 2018 allocation, except with the averages as proposed by Adam.
So that's under column G here, if I'm not mistaken. So to compare the tables now where you have percent change from 2017 harvest to 2018, you have tables B1 and B2, which show the percentages as set forth in the addendum with the two options that were initially being considered. Now we have this new substitute motion with these new revised percentages, just over 10% reduction for the north, a 21.7% reduction for New Jersey, and a 19.34% liberalization for the states of Delaware through North Carolina. That's my understanding of the math that's just been done to enable the board to compare this proposal to the two that are in the addendum. Mark Alexander?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jessica, if you could put up that figure, please. A little hard to read, but the bar on the right is summer black sea bass. The bar on the left is summer flounder. In the summer flounder recreational fishery, we are considering a relaxation of measures, and it's barely above the threshold. Sea bass is at 229% of the target, and this proposal is asking the northern states to take a 10% cut. Our fishermen are going to be so frustrated they're going to be crazy. And there's no possible way that we can explain to them why this is happening. This is going to totally undermine their confidence in our ability to manage this resource. This is crazy. I don't know what else to say. It just doesn't make sense.
Thank you. I'll take two more comments and then we're going to need to vote. David Borden.
Quick, and I don't say this in a defensive manner at all. If individuals don't like what's up on the board, then propose something different. They have the option to do that.
Yes, thank you. That is true. I see just one more hand, and unless there's someone else with a compelling interest in commenting, I'm going to call a question after this last comment. Eric Reed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't need to go to two decimal places to count 6 to 4. That's my problem. I do appreciate the fact that, we just spent a lot of time trying to cooperate, but when you're bargaining from a losing position to start with, it really doesn't make you all that comfortable. What's going to happen in the north is going to be the discard rate is going to be so high that the payback for us is going to make it more foolish than it is now. That's where we're going. And that's what we're going to say we're going to do. We all know. We all know what happens. Those fish are going to go over the side. We're going to have to pay them back, and we're going to go down again. Yesterday we talked about waste. The gentleman from New Jersey mentioned waste when we were talking about the Maryland CE program. Of course, we also didn't look that far back in that effort, but this is going to create waste that is going to be insurmountable for the northern states until we redo this all again, and I'm not willing to support that. In our first action today, the northern region already lost 100,000 fish. That's what we lost already. We started out the day, we're down 100,000 fish. And here we are, we're not going to come out of this well, and that's where those fish are going to be. So we're just going to throw them over the side, and then we're going to pay it back, and that doesn't work for me. That's not what it's about. Cooperation is great, and I really do appreciate that, but we're not going to get anything that's close to being acceptable to us. And, I understand it's allocation, and my partners to the south, God bless you, you're going to get fish that you probably don't need. It's unfortunate that we can't transfer in the beginning of the year as opposed to the end of the year. Maybe we could solve some of these problems, but that is not going to happen. So just be aware that if we go down even this road here, I mean, okay, we lose, but we don't lose that much at 6-4, because that's where we're at. But yesterday we talked about waste. Today all we're going to do is create waste. So I'm glad we all, had a nice kumbaya moment yesterday, but we're not having it today.
And before I call the question, I'm just going to offer this thought for the board to think about as you deliberate on your vote. And that is the importance of the consistency of this decision-making process. The board has already adopted, by a prior vote, an approach based on exploitable biomass. And there were associated percentages, there were percentages associated with that approach, and there are now new percentages that are being offered up in this substitute, which I'm not sure relate as well to the prior decision by the board to take this exploitable biomass approach. I just am trying to be as fair and objective as I can in that comment. It's about the consistency of the decision-making process, not necessarily what's the right or wrong vote. With that, I'll call a 1-minute caucus, and then we'll call the question. Then I'll call the question. Thank you. Is the board ready for the question? This is on the motion to substitute. All in favor, please raise your hand. That's 6. Opposed, please raise your hand. That's 4. Abstentions? There are 2. Any no votes? The motion passes 6-4 with 2 abstentions. The substitute becomes the main motion. Is there any further discussion on the main motion? Is the board ready for the question? If so, all in favor, please raise your hand. There are 6. Opposed, please raise your hand. There are 4. Abstentions? There are 2. The motion passes 6-4 with 2 abstentions. And we are on to the next issue, which is management measures within a region. There are 2 options. A would be uniform regulations within a region. B would be a regulatory standard with conservation equivalency allowed. Would anyone on the board like to make a motion on this issue? Dr. Pierce.
I would move that for section 3.1.2.4, we adopt B, regulatory standard with conservation equivalency allowed.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Rob O'Reilly. Moved and seconded to adopt under section 3.1.2.4, option B, regulatory standard with conservation equivalency allowed. Discussion on the motion. John Maniscalco.
Northern states will need as much flexibility as possible in order to try to maintain some semblance of a fishery. So I support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Maniscalco. But to that, I want to amend, or maybe make a friendly amendment to say something like regulatory standard with conservation equivalence allowed, and waive the maximum deviation in days allowed for season length.
So Eric Reed is moving to amend the main motion by waiving the maximum deviation in days allowed for season length. I believe the current deviation is 30 days. This would waive that, and there would therefore be no limit on deviation with regard to season. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Mark Alexander. Moved and seconded. Is there discussion on the motion? Eric, do you want to go further?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The states are going to need flexibility to deal with the issues that are going to be in front of them. And I don't think, given our conversation earlier, that this is a very heavy lift. I mean, any conservation equivalence has to pass muster. And whether it's 31 days or 45 days or 46 and a half days, we're going to need to be able to deal with that. And I would really appreciate the fact if people would grant the flexibility, not only to states like mine, but to states that might need it in the future. So that's my reasoning for it, and I'd appreciate your support. Thank you.
Mark, did you want to speak to this?
Yes, thank you. In Connecticut, we have a peculiar situation where the abundance of legal-sized fish varies by latitude or longitude and season. There's a seasonal component to where the fish are distributed in Connecticut waters. It's critical that we be able to maximize our season to give equitable access to all our anglers and our for-hire industry. So I really appreciate, considering the hit we're going to take from the previous vote, that we do have the latitude here to try to at least, provide our fishery some semblance of a decent season and equitable access. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone like to speak in opposition to this motion? Is there any objection to this move to amend, this motion to amend? Seeing no objection, the motion passes by consent, and we now have an amended main motion. Further discussion on the amended main motion. Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask the northern states, given that I think through time, through the ad hoc approach, when there weren't limits to what the states could do as far as being flexible, do you have a concern that by waiving this maximum daily allowance is going to then not speak to what this addendum was for, which was to try to converge the states in that region that went in separate paths over the last 4 or 5 years? It's just a question, and if you don't have the concern, I'll certainly support this going forward.
Let me go to John, and then I'll go to Mark.
Thank you. I don't think it's ideal, but I think the fact that the states would be required to kind of always return to a base set of regulations in any given year does constrain just how far we might diverge. Thanks.
Mark?
And I was just going to say, there's the other two measures still would constrain us to how much we can change it. So, we're never going to get back to where we were, but at least we'll be able to have some workable solution in the state.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak on this now amended main motion? Is the board ready for the question? Is there any need to caucus? Seeing none, all in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you. Opposed? Any no votes? Any abstentions? The motion passes 11-0 with no abstentions. Thank you. We're on to the next issue. We have 2 more to go on this addendum, and the next issue is the evaluation and specification of measures. There are 2 options. A is status quo. B is adjusting management measures to the ACL. Would anyone like to make a motion on this issue? Mike Luisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to move to adopt under Section 3.1.2.5, Option B. I'm not sure that's the same one. Is that the same motion on the screen?
No, I think we're going to catch up quickly.
You're catching up, okay. So I have a slight adjustment to what you and I had discussed earlier, Mr. Chairman. So I'll go back and start over. Move to adopt under Section 3.1.2.5, Option B, parentheses, in concept, comma, adjusting management measures to the ACL with implementation delayed until pending further refinement by the board/council. And if I get a second for that, Mr. Chairman, I can speak to my reasoning behind the motion. Thank you.
Let me just make sure we've got that up there correctly. I don't know, Jess, were you able to follow that, or do you need it said again? Okay. The motion, is there a second to the motion? Seconded by Rob O'Reilly. So moved and seconded to move to adopt option B under section 3.1.2.5 in concept, adjusting management measures to the ACL with implementation delayed pending further refinement by the board/council. Mike, would you like to speak to your motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the idea behind this section of the addendum speaks to the direction and management that we seem to be going. Managing to the ACL, we've had that discussion a number of times, even just this week. Considering discards in our recreational fisheries management is something that I think is important for us to move forward on. When Caitlin was providing the comments from the AP, and she spoke to the fact that not everybody commented on this section because they weren't quite sure what it meant. Well, I was there at our hearing, and I would have fallen in with the rest of the folks there that wouldn't be able to comment on this section because they weren't quite sure what it meant. I think it's complicated. I believe that this action requires some consideration by the council as well, given that it would change the regulations and our council FMP. And so my proposal here is that we approve this section just in concept, and we put it on the docket for further discussions with the council and with Garfo and with staff, and it will come to fruition at a later date. And I didn't think that adding a date to this would help, given the amount of work that we already have on our plate. And so I'll leave it at that and see if anybody else has anything to offer.
Thank you, Mike. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so when you think about this, we have been managing by way of the RHL, and this is a situation that could be a potential benefit to the states, because MRIP, if you read the criteria or the tasks or the chores or however you look at them that are embodied in going to a management system to ACL, it really is clearly, can you do a better job with MRIP? Can you have less hostile interviews? Can you have better samples? And the criteria indicate that there's a chance to do that. A few years ago, I'd say, no, this isn't very good, but now all the states have authority over MRIP, and so there's a direct link to the states being able to improve on the elements that are defined under this particular strategy. So I think it's a really good thing. It does take some coordination through the council, we know that, and I understand fully why Mike Louisi is framing this as a concept, so thank you.
Thank you. And just chatting with staff here, there is some interest in at least a sense from the board as to how long a delay the board has in mind here. Is there an intent to have this worked out during, say, this current calendar year, or is it something that may just take as long as it needs to? Obviously, if it's postponed indefinitely, what does it really mean? But if it's postponed until either a date certain or at least a projected year, then maybe we have a little bit more to go on in terms of what it is we're trying to achieve within whatever time frame that might be. Just wondering if the board wishes to add any of that clarity or is comfortable leaving it as is. Rob?
I can't attach a date to that, of course, but I think we would need a follow-up report so that we then can talk about it again. I think that's where we are now.
Okay. John?
So if we're going to going to manage by the ACL, I think it would be important to have up-to-date stock biomass information so that we're actually somewhere in the realm of trying to work with a target that's actually close. So I would hold off on any implementation until we actually had a stock assessment updated. That's my first comment. My second comment, with regards to MRIP and their success, I have a lot of faith in the people who are currently running APIS for New York State. But the decisions we make here, the regulations we use to constrain our fisheries, colors our anglers' response to our samplers. So when we're forced to adopt more restrictive rules that fly in the face of what the anglers are seeing out on the water that appear counterintuitive, they're not going to cooperate, and we're not going to get better data. We're not going to get better responses. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion on this motion? Is the board ready for the question? Is there a need to caucus? Seeing no need or interest in a caucus, I'll call the question. All in favor, please raise your hand. That's 9. Thank you. Opposed? No votes. Abstentions? 2 abstentions. So the motion passes 9-0 with 2 abstentions. And we are on to the last issue under Addendum 30, which is the time frame for addendum provisions. There were 2 options set forth in the draft. One is up to 2 years through 2019. The other is up to 3 years through 2020. Would anyone like to make a motion on this last issue? Of course, as always, the board can, regardless of the time frame adopted, that doesn't preclude the board from moving forward with action in the meantime, if so inclined. It just means that the board could allow this addendum to roll for up to 2 years or up to 3 years, depending on which time frame is adopted. Would anyone like to make a motion? Roy Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move adoption of 3.2A, 2 years.
Thank you. Is there a second to that? Seconded by David Borden. Roy, would you like to speak to your motion?
Just quickly, for all the reasons that were discussed this afternoon, I think we would be wise to consider a 2-year time frame rather than a 3. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the motion? Make sure we get it up first. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Motion. So move to approve option A in section 3.2, a 2-year time frame for addendum provisions. Is the board ready for the question? Mark?
I'd like to make a motion to amend, change that to 1 year.
Is there a second to that? Seconded by Eric Reed. Discussion on the motion, Mark?
I can't help but think that what we did today is half-baked, and I don't want to live with that for 2 years. That's essentially it.
Of course, this would force us now to start probably at our May meeting, if at the earliest, with a new addendum, which is fine. Just making sure we're all clear on what this means. If it's a 1 year only, that means we've got a new addendum process starting relatively soon. Tony Kearns?
I'd just like to remind the board that we do have this framework/addendum that we started with the council that will look at conservation equivalency for black sea bass. So all of these types of issues can be included in that document because however, just like summer flounder, we tied over all the measures for the shares could be tied into that document. So you could take all of this and redo it during that time frame. Whether or not we can finish that in time for 2019 or not, I don't know. But again, if we do this again, just like we did this year, so I don't know how that would work, where we would start our own addendum and then have this framework/addendum that we're trying to do for conservation equivalency with the council at the same time. The overlap seems like it's duplicative. I can't promise that the framework/addendum will get done in time for 2019 or not. We will do our best to try to do that, but it depends on the types of options that get included into the document and how long it takes to get it to move forward through the two bodies. But if we're doing two documents that are practically the same on top of each other, that might prove to be confusing to the public as well as difficult on staff load. So having a 2-year time frame might be good for this document in the sense that if that other framework doesn't get finalized for 2019, you would have something to fall into. But it makes it difficult to do another document in 1 year's turnaround when we have this other document ongoing at the same time.
David Borden.
At the risk of leaping off the waterfall one more time, I totally agree with Tony's logic. We've done this before. Why not just, I would be happy to perfect the motion so the original motion, underlying motion basically says to implement it for 1 year and the board retains the right to extend it for a year. Which would put us in the position that if we have to extend it, then we do. But the 1 year deadline, I like the 1 year deadline, and I'm glad it was suggested. Thank you.
Caitlin, do you want to respond to what David just said?
Yes, thank you. So option A under timeframe for addendum provisions does include that possibility. In both of these options, it's written that the board could, through a vote, extend the management program for either 1 year or 2 years. But if they chose to not extend the addendum, that would also be possible.
Eric, did you want to jump in?
So my question is, but is it extended from 2 years to 3 or 2 years to 4? Or is it 1 year to 2? I'm sorry, I'm not. You have to tell me specific.
Option A would be that at the end of 2018, the board could vote to extend the addendum into 2019, and it would end at the end of 2019.
So, there's been some interesting discussion on sort of the variances on these on the motions. With that, we have a motion to amend to substitute a 1 year time frame. That's before the board right now. Is there further discussion on that motion to amend? To substitute? Is Rob O'Reilly?
Just want to make sure that I can keep up with Caitlin there, who did a very good job at our public hearing, by the way. Thank you. A, under 3.2 at least, I'm looking at that, talks about after 2019, and I think what was just talked about was after 2018. So I'm trying to make sure that yes, this will carry through 2018, and yes, the board could come back and say, let's go another year. Is that exactly what you're indicating, Caitlin?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Which is different than the substitute motion, which would force the board's hand to come up with a new addendum for 2019. So we really are talking about two different things here. So I just want to make sure the board's clear on the decision that you're about to make as to whether you're going to only have this addendum that's about to be approved in effect for 1 year or up to 2 years. Mike Luisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll just add, having been out in your seat for the last few years and having been a part of these addenda that just continue, we'd have to start an addendum in the late summer in order for it to be complete through the winter to set regulations for 2019. I'm not sure 1 year, there's not going to be any new information that's going to inform a new addendum, so I would certainly support that flexibility under the original option, and I'm going to have to oppose the substitute. Thanks.
And again, I don't want to get into a repetitive mode here, but I'm just going to remind the board that if option A were selected, it does not preclude the board from deciding at some point, whether it be at the May meeting, the August meeting, whatever, to to initiate a new addendum, perhaps based on any feedback that might come as a result of today's decisions. And then, of course, as Tony indicated, there is this parallel process that the board is already engaged in with the council, which could very well overlap. So a lot of moving parts. I realize we're getting long in the tooth here, but let's call I'd like to call the question, unless Mark, you want to offer something, Mark?
Yeah, I'm now reading option A more carefully. So just to confirm that I understand this correctly, this addendum, if approved, would be in effect for 2018 and would only be extended to 2019 with a board vote. Is that correct?
That's correct. So
right,
if there's
that is what I proposed and Dave Borden proposed to add on to it, basically, right?
I think David Borden did correctly understand the issue associated with his motion, option A.
Okay,
Your motion, Mark, is a different motion. It means the board has to have another addendum developed, and let's put it this way. If the board were not to vote, under option A, if the board were not to vote to continue the addendum in 2019, we'd go back to default coastwide measures. There would be no addendum in place. So there would be, I want to make sure, staff is nodding yes. So that would be the decision that the board would have to make at the end of 2018 is, do they want to continue the program or not? If not, we refer back, go back to default.
I'm going to withdraw the motion.
Well, that's the board decision. Is there any objection to withdrawing the motion to amend to substitute to 1 year? Seeing no objection, I don't want to move too quickly. I don't see any objection. So that motion is withdrawn, and we're back to the main motion. Further discussion on the main motion? Is the board ready for the question? If so, all in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you. Opposed? Abstentions? 1 abstention. The motion passes 10-1 with 1 abstention. Believe it or not, I think we've completed the process of, we have one final vote. It was 10-0. I may have mischaracterized the last vote. It was 10-0 with 1 abstention. I apologize. The final vote, or the final motion, will need to be on final adoption of Addendum 30 as modified today, or in accordance with today's, I believe we have a motion up on the board, and there it is. Move to approve. No, that's not it. We need a motion up on the board to reflect the final approval. Here it is. Move to approve Addendum 30 as modified today. Would anyone like to make that motion? Moved by John Clark. Is there a second? Is there a second to the motion? Rob O'Reilly, thank you. Moved and seconded by Mr. Clark and Mr. O'Reilly to approve Addendum 30 as modified today. Does the board need any time to caucus? This is a final action. Do we need, Tony?
Just we should probably determine the time frame, implementation time frame. So it's either effective immediately, or we could work out the dates in which the proposals would come forward and the board would approve those. And I think you could use the end, like no later than the end of March for that board approval.
And you think it's important to do that before final approval of the addendum? Okay,
Yes,
so just to make sure, I think Caitlin put this very well, but my notes here indicate that the next steps would be states within each region need to submit proposed measures to achieve their allocation of the RHL by a date certain, and that's what we need. And we need to specify that today. The measures should be submitted to Caitlin, who in turn will forward them to the TC for review. Assuming that we would want the TC to include Wave 6 data in their evaluation, the due date should probably be sometime after February 15th, maybe even sooner. The TC will then review and evaluate the proposals and make recommendations to the board regarding their viability. So that, and smoothing would be applied. Once the TC completes its review, it'll report out to the board, and the board will meet via conference call to review and approve the final measures for each state within each region. And that should happen no later than mid-March. So just want to make sure the board's clear on that process. And as Tony had suggested, I think it would help to have a date certain for the submittal of management measures to Caitlin. Today is the 8th. A week from today would be the 15th. 2 weeks from today would be the 22nd. Tony?
I would just want confirmation that we do want to use the Wave 6 numbers from the board, and then all I would need for a compliance date from you then would be the end of March. So we could say March 31st, and we would be able to make sure we had a board meeting by then.
So, two questions to the board, I guess. One is, does the board wish to include Wave 6 data in the analysis by the TC? And then I think we also need a date for proposals to be submitted to Caitlin.
Well, that will depend on whether or not Wave 6 data actually comes out on time, which we have indications that it will. But if it doesn't, I don't want to hammer the TC into a date that they can't meet.
Understood. So, question to the board. Is there, what's the will of the board as far as including Wave 6 data? Rob O'Reilly?
Just a question. So Wave 6 data may be available, but it would still be preliminary. Is that the case?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on this issue? Is there any objection to using Wave 6 data in the analysis that the TC will undertake? Seeing no objection, we'll assume that we'll take that to be the consensus opinion of the board to proceed in that fashion. If Wave 6 comes out on time, that's the 15th, which is a week from today, but as Tony indicated, we don't know exactly when, so do we just sort of leave it fluid in terms of states developing proposals, understanding that it would have to probably be at least a week or two from now?
Yeah, the proposals would roughly need to be in a week after we have the Wave 6 data released, and then we can set up a conference call. Caitlin will try to use her crystal ball and predetermine a call date so the TC has some time saved. And then from there, we will do a quick turnaround for a board conference call as well. And then if we have a compliance date by March 31st, then that gives us enough wiggle room for everything.
Okay, thanks. So my sense is that although let's say 2 weeks from today is the 22nd, that means 2 weeks from tomorrow is the 23rd. Let's say the 23rd as a rough estimate for when states should be trying to get their proposals into the TC. And as far as a March 31 compliance date, that would be, is that something that we need sort of baked in here right now in terms of the motion, or just, is that by consent?
Implementation date, just to say that that's when the addendum is final, because we would have all those proposals that we could put in as an appendix that the states have given us, and then recognize that the states may not tell us their exact measures on March 31st, but at least we have a set of measures that would meet the requirements of the plan so that we can send a letter to NOAA letting them know that we are moving forward as the FMP states.
So would you suggest amending this motion to add at the end with a March 31 implementation date? Is there any objection to modifying the motion as indicated, that is by adding a March 31 implementation date? Seeing no objection, that will the motion is so amended, and we're ready for the final vote on it. Unless there's any further discussion, this will conclude our deliberations on Addendum 30. Is the board ready for a vote? Do we need a roll call? It is a roll call, so Caitlin will call a roll.
Are there any objections to the motion? Okay, then we'll do a roll call vote.
Whatever order you want to go.
All right. New Hampshire?
Absent.
Absent. Okay. Massachusetts?
No.
Rhode Island?
No.
Connecticut?
No.
New York?
No.
New Jersey?
Yes.
Delaware?
Yes.
Maryland?
Yes.
PRFC?
Yes.
Virginia? Fish and Wildlife Service? No. Absent. NIMS?
Abstain.
Okay.
The motion passes 6-4 with one abstention. I'm going to just keep rolling. David Borden?
Just a quick point, Mr. Chairman. We voted based on that revised table. I don't think any of us have it electronically, so I'd ask Caitlin to circulate it. And I think it would be handy to actually calculate the poundage and put the poundage in the table so that when circulated to everybody, including our advisors, so that they can actually see what the impact is, one alternative strategy versus another.
Yeah, I'm going to suggest we put that right in the addendum. I mean, that is the final decision of the board. The addendum should be very clear on what the decision was as reflected by those tables. So I'm going to not only just, to your point, yes, distribute it to the board, and yes, add it into the addendum itself, so everybody
I think it'll be handy to have that as soon as possible.
Agreed. Adam?
I understand that there are smoothing approaches that the TC is not fully worked through or implemented, which may change those numbers. So I don't know at what point you want to distribute those between a document that went out for public, something that we modified here today, something that the TC then modifies a week, 2 weeks down the road. You may just wish to consider those percentages in pounds until that smoothing approach has been clarified, so we know what we're doing in 2018 and trying to best inform the public.
My understanding is that the smoothing approach would only affect the measures. It would not affect the percentages or the poundage. So
it would affect the column G that was the percent reduction for 2018, but I agree with you, it wouldn't affect the pounds or the percent allocations.
Thank you for that. Okay, I think we've spent quite a bit of time on Addendum 30, and isn't it ironic that we may well go right until 5 o'clock here, but we'll try and move through the rest of this agenda as quickly as we can. I'm not going to pause for a break because we already have paused enough, I think. Item 5 is to consider the tabled black sea bass motion. This is a final action item. There's a memo to the board from Caitlin in the meeting materials that refreshes this item to summarize. At our joint meeting in December, the board and council considered but did not approve a set of measures for federal waters. The motion, which will be put up on the screen, if it isn't already up, was tabled for the purpose of enabling the board to first take final action on Addendum 30. Now that that has happened, we're ready to take up the tabled motion. So with that, I'll just note that the Mid-Atlantic Council is slated to take final action on this very same motion at its meeting next week in North Carolina. So we're back into parallel actions here with the intent to now finalize this, having now the dust having cleared, so to speak, on the Addendum 30 approach. We're ready to now finalize action on this measure. So my understanding is that the measure is up on the board. It's properly before the board in that it was tabled to this meeting, and therefore we don't need a motion to bring it back. It's already back and before the board. We just, and I guess we've already had it's already been moved and seconded. So we're actually ready to just simply have any final discussion on it if need be, and if there is no other discussion, we would vote on it. Mike Louisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think something that I just feel we should point out, there was a lot of discussion over the last year, even the last couple years, about the current federal water mid-season closure that occurs, I believe, starts in September and goes in through until October. The motion before us would eliminate that closure and allow states the flexibility under what we just determined to be the 2018 allocations to have an open season during that closure. And it also, there was a lot of interest from Rhode Island and the Block Island fishermen that this would cover them as far as not having that closure to be accounted for. It's just something to point out.
Thank you for that. Any further discussion on this motion? Is the board ready to vote? Any need to caucus? it is a roll call because it's a final action, so is there a need to caucus? I don't see any need, so I guess I can, in lieu of a roll call, I can ask, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no objection, the motion passes by consent, and we are on to the next item, which is the review and consider approval of state proposals for recreational summer flounder and scup measures for 2018. This is, as every item on the agenda, I think, of another final action item. Two issues to be addressed. I think Kirby's going to be taking the mic on this to kind of brief the board on exactly what's before the board. The first issue pertains to the recreational summer flounder measures for 2018. The board will need to consider and approve the methodologies proposed by the states and regions, which have been reviewed by the technical committee. The second issue pertains to the recreational scup measures for 2018. The board will need to consider and approve the specific measures proposed by the states, which have also been reviewed by the TC. And I think Kirby has a presentation or at least some sort of characterization on both issues, so I'll turn the floor over to Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to be quick because I know you all have been around the table for quite some time. Just as an FYI, we have my colleague Jeff Kipp up on the table as well. He was on the call, and he will be helping me answer any questions that might come up on some of the more technical components. So with that, we'll get into it. The outline, I'm going to give a little bit of background for you all in terms of the board's previous discussion on summer flounder and scup measures for 2018. I will go through the proposals, first for summer flounder and then for scup. After each one, I will take any questions, and then it will be for the board to take up management action, separate motions specific to summer flounder and to scup. So for background, the board voted to extend regional management under Addendum 28 for summer flounder back in December 2017. The board specified that states and regions could liberalize harvest through their measures in 2018 up to 17% above 2017 preliminary harvest through Wave 4. What this created was a de facto 2018 coastwide harvest target of about 3.78 million pounds. The 2018 recreational harvest limit is 4.42 million pounds. So again, there's a little bit of a buffer between that de facto harvest target and what our actual RHL is. There was a call that the technical committee held on January 16th. Summer flounder and scup proposals were reviewed on that call. It's an important note is that all states and regions, with the exception of North Carolina, submitted proposals, and that overall the TC recommended the approval of methodologies used to develop those summer flounder proposals. So before I get into each of those proposals, I want to highlight some of the comments that the technical committee put forward. Two important ones. First, that there's a continual issue in terms of the lack of uniformity in how analysis is done in these annual adjustments to management measures based on MRIP data regarding taking either reductions or liberalizations. So the TC wanted to make clear to the board that if the intent is to continue annual adjustments for these measures into the foreseeable future, prioritizing the development of a new set of standard operating procedures, or SOPs, as has been presented to the board at previous meetings, should be prioritized. The second point is that the TC remains concerned about the status of the summer flounder resource. While liberalizations are on the table for 2018, reductions may be needed for the 2019 fishing season and beyond based on the results of the 2018 benchmark stock assessment that will be completed later this year. So, to the point on methodologies, they vary by state and by the measures that were changed. There are three components that we, on the technical committee, go through in evaluating harvest and then adjusting measures. They are either bag limit analysis, they are size limit analysis, and season analysis. And under each of those, depending on the state or region, different approaches were used. For the bag limit analysis, there's an additive approach. What this does is it assumes that every intercept at the current bag limit would catch one more fish if allowed by regulations, and adds that fish to those intercepts in a decaying manner. For example, if the proposed bag limit represents a one fish increase from the current bag limit, one fish is added to the intercept at the current bag limit. The other types of approaches were either statistical Poisson or negative binomial distributions and regressions done off of that. For the size limit analysis, either log regressions or generalized linear model GLMs were used to try to determine what reductions in size limit would result in increases in harvest. And then for season analysis, data across multiple years and waves were used to come up with daily percent harvest rates to determine how either increasing or decreasing the harvest in numbers of, or the season and number of days would affect the harvest. For some states that involved if multiple changes and measures were looked at an interaction equation, but not all states put forward multiple changes. So with that, I will go through the proposals now by state. Starting in the north, just to clarify, all of these proposals are included in the meeting materials, so I'm trying to give you guys the highlights on them. On the screen right now is Massachusetts 2017 measures, 17-inch minimum size, 4-fish bag limit in a season of May 22nd to September 23rd. That resulted in 2017 in a 26,000 fish harvest. In terms of that percentage change from 2016, as you remember, Addendum 28 laid out that we needed to achieve a certain harvest harvest reduction in order to maintain harvest at or below the 2017 RHL. For Massachusetts, it was a 54% reduction in harvest. For 2018, their proposal includes increasing their bag limit by 1 fish and extending their season up to 16 days, so it would be from May 23rd through October 9th. For Rhode Island, the 2017 measures were a 19-inch minimum size, 4-fish possession limit, and a season of May 1 through December 31st. In terms of their performance in 2017, it was a 31% reduction relative to 2016, so approximately 58,000 fish were harvested. For 2018, they are proposing to increase their bag limit by 2 fish. In considering the Connecticut through New York proposal, their measures in 2017 were a 19-inch minimum size, a 3-fish possession limit, and a season of May 17 to September 21st. This resulted in a harvest of approximately 352,840 fish. And I want to make clear in the memo, what was listed in terms of their harvest for 2017 was their harvest in weight. And so there was maybe some confusion there if you saw that, because it was 1.2 million fish. It was in fact in pounds. In terms of their change in harvest from 2016 to 2017, that was a decrease in harvest of about 68%. They proposed a number of options, and I'm not going to try to go through all of them, but they involved either increasing the number of days in their season, increasing the bag limit, or reducing the size limit by a 1/2 inch. There were 4 proposed options that were included. They are up on the screen now and are included in the memo. Next, there was New Jersey's proposal. As you all are aware, in 2017, the minimum size for New Jersey was 18 inches. The bag limit was 3 fish, and the season was May 25th to September 5th, 104 days. This resulted in a harvest of about 433,000 fish, which was a 42% reduction in their harvest from 2016. The initial proposal options that were put forward used an average 2018 harvest target, which was higher than the 17% increase in harvest from 2017 levels. On our call, that analysis was further refined and made to match the corrected 2018 harvest target for the state of a 17% increase. Similar to Connecticut through New York, they proposed multiple options. All of the options that they put forward sought to increase their season length from 104 days up to either 121, 122, or 125 days. Continuing to move down the coast, the states of Delaware through Virginia put forward a proposal. In 2017, their measures were 17-inch minimum size, a 4-fish possession limit, and a season of 365 days. This resulted in a harvest of about 148,000 fish, which was a 231% increase from 2016 levels. In terms of the proposed measures for 2018, they proposed reducing their size limit by a 1/2 inch. It's important to note that on the call, the technical committee discussed that depending on the data set used, the regression analysis could show varying levels of percent increases in harvest from 12% up to 26%. That being said, the technical committee did not find issue with the methodology used and recommended approval of the proposal. So, having gone through all the proposals, I thought it would be helpful for the board to consider how performance across the coast in aggregate looked in 2017, what a 17% liberalization in harvest for 2018 would look like, and what the 2018 harvest would look like based on the numbers put forward in the proposals. So the main takeaway here is that based on the proposals submitted, the harvest in 2018 would increase to about 15.8% from 2017 levels. And this is approximately 81% of the 2018 RHL in numbers of fish. And as we often do, we calculated this by coming up with an average fish weight using 2017 data and dividing the 2018 RHL by that average fish weight. So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirby. Questions for Kirby? Seeing none, do we have a motion teed up yet, or is it, there is a motion teed up, so let's get that up on the screen. This will be, I'm sorry, I moved too quickly. Mike.
Just a question. So I'm wondering, and maybe this is a question for you, Mr. Chairman, or Kirby can help us out. Have we, as a board, already decided to allow a state, or all of us as states within our regions, have we already agreed to allow for that 17% liberalization, or have we only agreed at this point to have the states propose those measures, and we need to make a final decision today as to whether or not we can go home as a unit and implement 17% liberalizations, so I'm just unclear about what we've already decided. Have we said that 17% liberalization is completely fine given the status of the stock, and those proposals, if implemented, will achieve that? Because I wasn't clear coming to the meeting today that that was the case.
Kirby?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mike, based on the board's discussion in December, the board agreed to allow proposals that had no more than a 17% liberalization in harvest relative to 2017. Now, as we do annually, the states put forward those proposals, and if the board were to approve the methodologies of those proposals today, then that means that the states could go home and under those proposals possibly implement measures up to a 17% increase in harvest.
Go ahead.
So the flip side of that would be for the board to take action today to maintain status quo for 2018 and not allow for liberalizations. We could still do that today if that's the pleasure of the board.
If it's the pleasure of the board, that is correct.
And I was just going to go look for the motion. I mean, I do remember this being an issue that was decided upon by the board. I believe there was a motion, and the issue had to do with the liberalization based on what? And I would have to go back and review that. But I was, if I'm remembering correctly, there was already a decision made by the board via a motion that was adopted at the meeting, or am I mixing?
Well, just to clarify, the board has not specified what the measures are for 2018. So the board did specify continuing the regional management approach that is outlined under Addendum 28, and that there was the ability for states to go back and develop proposals to achieve no more than a 17% liberalization in harvest relative to 2017 levels for 2018. But right now there are no measures specified for 2018, so it's at the pleasure of the board in terms of whether to approve the methodologies in those proposals and then go home and potentially implement an increase in harvest up to 17% collectively on the coastwide level, or to maintain status quo measures. Those are both possible options.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I'm just trying to look through my notes to find that motion. I was quite sure that I remembered that had already been moved and adopted. But at any rate, Dr. Pierce.
Well, I'm a bit confused now. You described the methodology that the different states use. All right, maybe I missed it. Weren't the proposals offered up by all the individual states, given the thumbs up by the technical committee?
Yes, the technical committee signed off on the technical, like the technical nature of it in terms of the data used and the analysis conducted.
Right, all consistent with the previous decision that the states can have up to 17% increase.
That's correct.
All right, so going back to a status quo makes no sense to me in light of where we've been and where we now need to go. And with that said, again, a clarification, if I may. I'm a bit confused. From Delaware to North Carolina, did any of those states meet the fluke reduction required in 2017? I'm just trying to figure that one out. I don't think they did, so.
So regarding state or region-specific harvests, as I laid out, we have information on how their harvests performed relative to the measures. So collectively on a coast-wide level, the needed reduction to meet the 2017 RHL was achieved. When looking at region or state-specific performance, it varied across the coast. Many regions had a reduction in harvest, but some regions did have an increase in harvest.
Further discussion on this? Adam Nowalski?
I'm ready to make a motion if you're so inclined.
Yes, please.
Move to approve the methodology for the state summer flounder 2018 proposals.
Is there a second to that? Seconded by Eric Reed. Moved by Adam Nowalski and seconded by Eric Reed to approve the methodology for the 2018 summer flounder recreational proposals. I think I've got that right. Here it is. Move to approve the methodology for the summer flounder proposals and methodologies for use in the 2018 recreational summer flounder fishing season as recommended by the technical committee. Adam, are you comfortable with that language?
Yes, I am, and I'll just add while I have the microphone that this is already precautionary, this 17%. We had the opportunity to do something much larger based on the ABC recommendation from the SSC, but we agreed to be extremely conservative in that. And that last slide that said these measures only would account for 81% of the RHL. I understand that some people have concerns about the status of the stock, but that's a number for people listening in here that we're setting forth measures that potentially leave up to 20% of the available harvest in the water. We're extremely precautionary. I'm very comfortable with this. I wouldn't support maintaining status quo for 2018 with the information we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion on the motion? Is the board ready for the question? Any need to caucus? Looks like everyone looks like they're ready to vote, so I'll call the question. All in favor, please raise your hand. It's a final action, so if you could put your hands down, let me ask it this way. Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes by unanimous consent. Thank you. I think we're on to Scup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll move on to the Scup proposals. So, again, trying to go through this as quickly as possible. As background, the board voted to extend the ad hoc regional management for Scup for the 2018 fishing season. The board also tasked the technical committee with doing analysis on what a 1-inch size limit decrease for the states of Massachusetts through New York would result in terms of 2018 harvest. The board specified that the states and regions could liberalize harvest through measures in 2018 to achieve the RHL of 7.37 million pounds. In 2017, preliminary harvest through Wave 5 was 4.65 million pounds. That's about based on performance in 2017 and the 2018 RHL, that would be approximately a 59% liberalization in harvest. So, as part of the technical committee call I referenced before, Massachusetts through New York put forward their analysis as well as a proposal, and the state of New Jersey also put forward a proposal. Massachusetts through New York's proposal initially was unclear of what the proposed measure changes they were interested in achieving. analysis had been done on both a size limit change as well as a bag limit increase on the bonus season, which varies depending on the state and the region. The proposal was subsequently revised to only request the size limit change, and overall the TC found the analysis and methodology technically sound and recommended both proposals for approval. Regarding the Massachusetts through New York proposal, analysis was done, as I said, on both size limit and bag limit changes. For 2017, the states of Massachusetts through New York had a 10-inch minimum size, and that was specific to all fishing modes with the exception of the shore-based selected sites in the states of Rhode Island and Connecticut, which had a 9-inch minimum size. The analysis found that a decrease in 1 inch for the size limit would increase harvest by approximately 27% for the region. Regarding the bonus season change in the bag limit, that was also explored, and that would be moving from a 45-fish bag limit to a 50-fish bag limit. A Poisson and additive approach was used to do this analysis, and it showed that an increase in harvest from both size and bag limit changes would be in the range of about 47% to 39%. The TC acknowledged when looking at this report that there was some risk in the assumption that the harvest of 9-inch fish would be the same at 10 inches or 11 inches or 12 inches, largely because there's a higher availability of smaller fish at lower size. MRIP length frequency data indicates that anglers in the region are likely already self-selecting for fish larger than 10 inches. And the TC noted that when looking at information regarding the shore-based harvest, in dropping that minimum size from 9 inches to 8 inches, the harvest would be significantly less in terms of that change than the other fishing mode. In looking at the New Jersey proposal, New Jersey was not interested in changing their size limit as they are already at a 9-inch minimum size, and instead proposed changing their season length from 243 days to a 365-day season. New Jersey's season in recent years has included January 1st through February 28th and July 1st through December 31st. There's high variability in harvest between years and waves, and so this created some challenge for the technical committee member from New Jersey in estimating harvest during some of the previously closed periods. Gap filling was done by averaging harvest across multiple waves, and the proposed change in the season length would result in an approximately 34% increase in harvest. In terms of technical committee feedback, the group was in agreement that the gap filling approach used was sufficient. There were some questions about characterizing New Jersey's recreational scup fishery, and it was noted by the TC member that increasing the season to include March through June would likely not significantly increase harvest, as the species is not as sought after as summer flounder and black sea bass. So similar to what I put forward regarding summer flounder combined harvest increases, for Massachusetts through New York, in looking at a 27% increase in their harvest, that would result in approximately 5.1 million pounds. Again, this includes just the size limit analysis of going from 10 inches to 9 inches. For New Jersey, in terms of a 34% increase in their harvest from 2017, that would be approximately 794,000 pounds. The combined harvest increases from these two changes for those two regions, or excuse me, those two proposals would be approximately 6.73 million pounds, which is below the 2018 RHL of 7.37, approximately 91% of it. So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirby. Questions for Kirby? Seeing none, we would need a motion, and I believe in this case it's a motion to approve the specific measures, not the methodology. Adam Nowosky?
I think I got what the desired changes are here. Move to approve a size limit change for the states of Massachusetts through New York to a 9-inch minimum size for the 2018 season. For the states of Rhode Island and Connecticut, I'm sorry, let me back up. Move to approve a size limit change for the states of Massachusetts and New York for a 9-inch minimum size limit for 2018. No, I had it right the first time.
It's up on the
Move to
board.
approve a size limit change for the states of Massachusetts through New York of 9-inch minimum size limit for the 2018 recreational scup fishing season. For the states of Rhode Island and Connecticut, the minimum size limit at shore site programs would be set at an 8-inch minimum size limit. I'd also like to add to move to approve an open season length of January 1st to December 31st for the state of New Jersey for the 2018 recreational scup season.
The first part is up, the second part is being typed as we speak. Is there a Let me first ask, is there a second to the motion? I realize it's still being put up, but I think it's clear in terms of the intent. John Maniscalco seconds it, but we'll pause until we get it up. Okay, thank you, Jess. And John Maniscalco was the seconder. Thank you. So we have a moved and seconded. I won't reread it because Adam did such a great job the first time. With that, is there any discussion on the motion? This is a final action item, so I'll have to ask any further, and let me just make sure we don't rush too quickly. Is there any discussion on the motion? Is the board ready for the question? If so, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no objection, the motion passes by unanimous consent, and we're on to sort of the second to last issue on the agenda, and that is, first we need to do consideration and approve. So, item 7, consider approval of 2017 Scup FMP review and state compliance reports. Staff is definitely getting this teed up and ready, so we'll wait for that. Kirby?
Start on slide 1 and then go to 7. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're just working to try to truncate the FMP review presentation. So, as the board is aware, at the October meeting, the summer flounder and black sea bass FMP reviews were taken up and subsequently done by board vote. The Scup FMP review was delayed due to a concern with Massachusetts state compliance. At the time, Massachusetts did not have measures in place to enforce the minimum size requirements for the threshold for triggering the requirements in its small mesh squid fishery. In January of this year, we received a memo that was included in the briefing materials that outlined how the state of Massachusetts would come back into compliance with those components of the FMP prior to the start of their small mesh squid fishery. Additionally, the only other note regarding the FMP review and state compliance reports is that the state of Delaware is requesting de minimis. So with that, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Thank you.
Questions for Kirby? Looks like Massachusetts is all set. They've offered a way forward that would bring them into compliance. So with that, I think the board's ready to take action, final action on the FMP review, and that would be a move to approve the FMP review for Scup. Is there anyone who would like to make that motion? Moved by Dr. Pierce. Is there a second? Seconded by John Clark. Discussion on the motion? Is there any opposition to the motion? Tony?
Can you just read into the record since we don't have our minute taker?
Yes. Move to accept the Scup Fishery Management Plan review of the 2016 fishing year and approve de minimis request from Delaware. Moved by Dr. Pierce, seconded by Mr. Clark. Is the board ready for the question? Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes by unanimous consent. Thank you. Is that it on that item, Kirby?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Item 8, election of vice chair. David.
Just like about 30 seconds to make a just general point and use this as an example. The scup stock, in terms of fishing mortality, is basically 1/2 of what it could be. In other words, we could liberalize the fishing mortality substantially. The SSB is 2 times what it needs to be. And yet we continue to agonize over these yearly adjustments and minor tinkering with regulations. We got to find a different strategy here where we relieve some of the pressure on our technical people to do these types of reports, and like a 2-year system or whatever. There just isn't the need to agonize over these fine details every single year when we have that big a buffer in the stock. Personal opinion.
And should we just leave that as an opinion? Does anyone want to offer a response? Tony?
These are annual compliance requirements of the FMP, so it's hard for us to not do them, but we'll talk about it and see what we can do. We'll come back to the board.
David?
Not to debate Tony, because she's correct, but that all that means to me is we should be changing the FMP to change the way we do business. That's the point.
David, I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. I thought you meant do the compliance reports every year. You mean recreational measures every year.
Okay. Well, we'll take that under advice. We'll take that advice and see what we can do with it. So, thank you, David. Anything else on Scup? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 8, which is the election of a vice chair. The position is currently vacant and needs to be filled. Are there any nominations for the position? John Carr?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to nominate our esteemed colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Adam Nowalski.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Eric Reed. Is there any discussion on the motion? Are there any other nominations that the board would like to make? Seeing none, we'll close. I forget how Pat used to say it. I could never duplicate that. But let's ask, is there any objection to the election of Adam Nowalski as vice chair of the Fluke, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board? Seeing no objections, congratulations, Adam. Look forward to working with you. Adam?
So I appreciate that vote of confidence from the board. Look forward to working with you as well. I got to say that, especially to the states to my right, I take no pride in what we did here today. I go home and I gave up my business because of what this management body has done with these regulations. And Mark put up the SSB chart before with these regulations, and I know firsthand what this does. It's wrong. It needs improvement. I'm encouraged by some of the steps that have been taken here. They don't go far enough yet, but you have my word that as vice chair, and hopefully I'm here long enough to become chair, that I'm fully committed to not putting ourselves in these positions to have to go home and tell our stakeholders that we're making more restrictive regulations on biomass that's double its target. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And with that, we're on to other business. I did add one item, and I'd like to just quickly move through it. There's already been very good discussion on it. Mike Luisi, John Maniscalco, and others have already called attention to the issue that I think is a very important one for this board to consider, and I'll just briefly summarize it. So the Mid-Atlantic Council's SSC has offered a recommended RHL for 2019 of 3.2, this is for Black Sea Bass, has offered a recommended RHL for 2019 of 3.27 million pounds. And as a reminder, in 2017, the RHL was 4.29. It dropped to 3.66 this year, and therefore is slated to go down even more so in 2019. Now, the council and board have not yet considered or approved the specifications for 2019, so that RHL is not cast in stone. But absent any new information, there may not be much to go on unless this fishery could become even more constrained in the year ahead. Against that backdrop, it's widely understood that the 2015 year class is very strong, yet it was not captured by the 2016 benchmark, since 2015 was the terminal year. So as that strong year class moves into the fishery, as it currently is, as I understand it, this year and next, we run the risk of missing it and thus facing an all too familiar situation where abundance continues to increase while harvest limits continue to decline. So the upshot is that we need an operational assessment update for Black Sea Bass, and we need it as soon as possible. My understanding is that the current assessment schedule is primarily focused on new benchmarks for summer flounder and striped bass, both of which will be the first to incorporate the new recalibrated MRIP data which is slated to be released this summer. Once those benchmarks are completed, the Science Center plans to conduct a series of operational updates in 2019, which will include black sea bass. My concern, and I think it's shared by many on this board, is that an operational update completed in, say, the spring of 2019 will be too late, since it won't enable the Council and Commission to consider adjustments to specifications for 2019 that reflect the strength of the resource as a whole, particularly the 2015 year class. So I think we have two potential directions that we can pursue. One would be to conduct whatever analysis we can in coordination with the Science Center at some point during the current calendar year, so that at the very least we can make the case for holding measures at status quo for 2019 vis-a-vis a status quo RHL. Another potentially more impactful approach would be to make a request to the NRCC that the operational assessment update for black sea bass be given first priority, with a view to having that update completed early enough in 2019 to influence 2019 specifications. That's my take on sort of where we are and what this board might wish to pursue. I'd look to either Mike as chair of the MID or John, who I know has had a strong interest in this issue, to kind of expound a bit on what I just, the foundation that I just set forth. But my sense is that it would be perhaps appropriate, maybe I would say it would behoove the board to perhaps make a request and see how it flies, given where we are with this resource and the chance that we take of missing this year class with a 2-year delay, if you will, before we can ratchet up the specs to match up the levels of abundance. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm a current member of the NRCC, and when we sit down and discuss assessment calendars, there's often conflict between the Mid-Atlantic and the New England Council as what comes first. But I think given the interest of black sea bass for both councils and the member states, that I think what you already mentioned, and I think a strong ask by this board for the NRCC to convince the Science Center that the sooner the better would help with that 2019 spec setting, if that's the case, would be something that I'd suggest. And I'll commit now as the Mid-Atlantic chair to make sure that I speak strongly at the next NRCC meeting on this issue.
Thank you for that. Does anyone want to add anything to this? David Borden?
Question, Mr. Chairman, do we need a motion on this?
I'm going to look to Tony because I'm not sure what the outcome would be. I am assuming this is in the form of a letter. So is the board able at this point to, by consent, support the development of a letter that would speak to the issues that were just raised? Bob Beal?
I'll give it a shot. I don't think we necessarily need a letter. I'm a representative on the NRCC, as is Mike, and there's other states represented there, and there's, the council staff is here, and Chris Moore is a member. So, I think if there's consensus by this board that accelerating black sea bass operational assessment is as much as possible to potentially impact the 2019 fishery, we can take that forward. That's all the direction we need, and we're all set.
So the record would be clear enough so all we need from the board is whether there is unanimous consent to move forward in this direction. Rob O'Reilly?
I think that's fine. I still think it's an uphill battle, probably. Sound science is supposed to be reproducible. And this is sort of probably an older framework, but who really has to do this operational assessment? I realize that at one time, and Tony Kern certainly remembers, the ASMSC was going to have a professor from New Hampshire do the bluefish assessment until I think he fell into illness, if I remember. And then a few years ago, there was some talk about having an outside the scope of ASMSC or council do the assessment. So I don't know what the contractual costs would be. I guarantee there are individuals who could do this operational assessment, and that may be one of the possibilities to consider rather than for having the only shot being having the NRCC, change its mind. So, I mean, that's something that that may or may not be feasible. I don't know. It hasn't been tried in a few years, but clearly it's a possibility.
Mike, I'm wondering if you could carry that message with you at the NRCC meeting in that, to the extent, to Rob's point, to the extent that the board, i.e. commission, can bring resources to bear and either through contractual arrangements or through collaboration with the Science Center, make this happen. I think my sense is that, we're ready to do whatever we can to try to make this happen, offering whatever resources we might have available. I don't know if that helps or not, but I think that's the sense I get from Rob's comment. Are you willing to bring that thought forward at the next NRCC? And by the way, when is that meeting, and when might we know what the response is?
I have no idea when the next meeting is. All I know is that I have another meeting to go to next week. I'm one week at a time at this point. We don't typically talk assessment schedules in our spring meeting. We can certainly bring it up as a point of discussion, as far as on the agenda. I don't know what we gain so an operational assessment is new terminology that's being used because of the influence of the MRIP calibrations. And the Science Center, I can't speak for the Science Center, but they're not quite sure how that's all going to translate into the new assessment work that's done. So this is not just a simple turning of the crank on just a new year's worth or new 2 years worth of data. There could be some changes. I think collaboration with the Science Center certainly has to be part of that. And I'm happy to, as Bob and I can discuss, if we decided we don't necessarily need a letter, but we can bring this forth and see what the feds what they have to say. I don't think there's much difference in a late 2018 or an early 2019 operational assessment anyway. I think we can get this done. There's enough interest and there'll be enough pressure put on the Science Center to get it done in time that it could help influence the 2019 quota. I'm pretty confident that we can pass that message strongly.
Thank you for that. Chris Patsevich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If the assessment stayed on the original schedule, and I think earlier we talked about if that was the case, and we could then reconsider the 2019 ABC and then have it implemented later in the year. Is that correct? If we didn't make this request, or this request wasn't accepted, we could still make a change in 2019. It would just come a little later in the year, correct?
Well, I guess the answer is yes. I don't know how feasible it is to make a change if the assessment doesn't happen until the spring, deep into the year. It seems to me you get into an awkward situation then trying to modify specifications mid-year. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess it'd probably be worse than what we just went through this past year. And we're rightfully so focused very much on the recreational fishery today, but when we had the new assessment update, a new benchmark assessment late in 2016, early 2017, the ABC changed about midway through the year. That had a pretty big impact on the commercial fishery, where there was a lot of quota that just wasn't available until middle part of the year. Then towards the end of the year, it was all available, and had a pretty negative impact on the markets. And I think what I'm doing, I'm just adding kind of further justification for this request we're talking about to try to get this done as soon as possible. This affects more than just recreational fishery. It can impact the commercial one too.
Good point. Appreciate that. Tony?
I would just also suggest that the states pull together as much data as they can from their survey work in order to provide that to the SSC when they do their review this summer, because the SSC still has to make a recommendation to have something on the books. And so if we are seeing these fish starting to move in through surveys, the SSC will have to take that under consideration. So if the states could compile that information in time for them to look at it, it will influence.
I think that's an excellent suggestion, and I see Caitlin making a note, so I'm going to suggest that on behalf of the board that Caitlin kind of reiterate what Tony just indicated by reaching out to the states and urging them to try to do their best to get that survey, updated survey information assembled and to the SSC in time for them to at least consider it for specification setting that they'll be undertaking this summer. So in other words, we're going to move forward in various ways, that being one, and then we'll certainly continue to put the pressure or exert the pressure as best we can through the NRCC process. Additional discussion on this? I know there's a lot of folks in this room who are very keenly aware of the importance of this issue and aware of where things stand. Adam?
So just briefly on that SSC issue, and I completely support what we're doing here, I believe the SSC has that ABC of 3.27 million pounds. We, as a joint body, just didn't approve recommending it to the service to promulgate as a final rule yet. So I don't know if the SSC even has their late June, July meeting where this is even on their agenda yet. So I think it's one step further than that. We've got to make sure that we get black sea bass in front of them, because as of right now, they're of the opinion they don't need to do anything. They've created the ABC calculation, which the council's not allowed to exceed by Magnuson, so it's that one step further that I think we need to make sure we get pushed onto their schedule.
Okay. Kirby, you want to just say that into the record rather than repeating it? Thank you.
So I'm communicating with my colleagues at the council in the back, but from what they've communicated to me, the SSC is set to meet in July, and they are going to consider black sea bass ABC for 2019 at that meeting.
All the more reason to follow through in the way that Tony just suggested. So let's really do our best, because obviously this has been a very difficult process today, working through this Addendum 30 exercise, and I think we really need to turn to the most, turn to where we can to try to improve the situation. It seems to me that stock status is a huge and important issue here, because if we can increase the size of the pie, we can perhaps achieve a little better relief on the allocation and specification side. David Borden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My suggestion would be that the staff send a memo out to all the states and basically ask for them to update the information by a certain deadline, provide that deadline, and then consolidate all that information for the SFC. Thank you.
Good suggestion. Thanks. This is exactly what I was hoping for, is to make sure this issue is front and center on the part of all of us, including our colleagues at the mid, and so we can communicate this up the chain as effectively as possible, and as is indicated, that the states will do their best to put their best foot forward on contributing information in a timely fashion. Any further discussion on this issue? Appreciate your time on it. I think it's obviously an important issue. Is there any other business to come before this board? Seeing none, is there any objection to adjourning? Seeing no objection, we are adjourned. Thank you very much. Have a safe travel home.